Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. There is a moment near the very end of the greatest poem to survive from the ancient world. A poem that is, on its surface, about a war, in which an old man walks alone across a dark battlefield at night, past the watchfires of an army that has spent 9 years trying to kill his sons, and kneels down in a tent belonging to the one man in the whole of that army who has personally killed more of his children than any other living soldier, and takes that man's hands, the same hands, the old man says, that have already ended so many of his own sons, and raises them to his own lips and kisses them. That old man is Priam, king of Troy. The man whose hands he kisses is Achilles, the greatest warrior the Greek imagination ever produced. A man built by every version of this story to be faster, stronger, and more devastating in battle than any other mortal alive. A man whose name alone was said to be enough to send the walls of an entire city into mourning. And it is worth sitting for a moment, right at the very start of tonight's story, with the strangeness of that image, an old king kissing the hands of his own children's killer, because it tells us, before we have gone a single step further, that this is not going to be a simple story about a hero winning a war. It is going to be a story about rage and about grief, and about a man who was given, quite literally, a choice between two entire lives, a long one and a short one, and who chose, with his eyes open, the short one. And it is a story about what a person actually becomes once they have made a choice of that size and have to go on living inside it day after day until the day it finally comes due. We are not going to rush toward the death of Hector tonight, tempting as that is, because Hector's death, however famous, is not actually the centre of this particular story, not really, and rushing to it would mean skipping past everything that makes it mean what it means. Achilles is a figure most people believe they already know, a name attached to one vulnerable heel and one legendary temper, a strong man from a summer blockbuster or a half-remembered high school reading assignment, and that familiar flattened version leaves out almost everything that actually mattered to the poets and the audiences who told and retold this story for 1,000 years before anyone thought to simplify it. We told the story of the whole Trojan War in this room once before, the long 10 years of it, the wooden horse, the fall of the city, the archaeology of a mound above a strait in what is now Turkey, and if you want that wider view, that story is still sitting here waiting for you on another night. Tonight is different. Tonight we're going to follow one single man, from the moment before his own birth, when the gods themselves quarrelled over what to do with him, through a childhood spent being raised, quite deliberately, on the marrow of lions, through a war he did not want to fight and could not honourably avoid, through a rage so total it nearly cost his own side the war it needed him to win, through the two deaths that actually shaped this whole story, one belonging to his dearest friend and one belonging to himself, and out the other side, into the strange, unfinished, 3,000-year-old argument about what exactly his life was worth, and to whom. Let us say the thesis plainly, here at the very beginning, the way we like to on this channel, so you know the shape of the night ahead of you. This is a story about a bargain almost nobody has ever actually offered. Spoken out loud to a young man by his own mother in words the old poem preserves nearly exactly. That he could live a long, safe, comfortable life at home, grow old among people who loved him, and be forgotten, the way nearly every one of us is eventually forgotten, or he could sail to a war on a foreign shore, win a glory so bright it would still be spoken of thousands of years later, and die there, young, before he had lived even half the years an ordinary man might expect. Achilles chose the second life. He chose it before the story we're about to tell even begins, and he spends the whole of it in ways that shift and complicate and very nearly reverse themselves before the end, discovering exactly what that choice actually costs, not in the abstract, the way it must have sounded when his mother first laid the two paths out in front of him, but in the specific, unbearable currency of an actual friend's actual death. And it is worth carrying that bargain with you through everything that follows tonight. because it is the single thread that ties this whole story together into something with a genuine aching shape. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, settle in for a long and unhurried night, and let yourself ease into the strange, glittering, sorrowful tale of Achilles, the swiftest of the Greeks, the greatest warrior the ancient world ever imagined, and by nearly every honest measure this story offers us, one of the loneliest men in the whole of Greek mythology as well. A wedding that the gods regretted attending, and a fruit with 3 words carved into its skin. To understand why a mother would ever sit her own son down and offer him, as a genuine and considered choice, a short life or a long one, we have to begin, as this whole story always begins, not with Achilles himself, but with his mother, a sea goddess named Thetis, and with a wedding that very nearly did not happen at all, because Thetis was, by every ancient account, one of the most beautiful and most capable of all the divine daughters of the old sea god Nereus, and both Zeus, king of all the gods, and his own brother Poseidon, god of the sea, had at different points in the older tradition desired her for themselves. A rivalry between the 2 most powerful gods in the entire Greek pantheon that might, under any ordinary circumstance, have ended with one of them simply taking her, the way gods in these stories so often simply took what they wanted from mortal and immortal women alike. And it is worth pausing before we go any further on the fact that Thetis herself is never once, in the whole of this long tradition, asked what she herself might have wanted in any of it. A silence this story is going to ask us to notice again and again tonight, in her own case and in a great many others besides. It did not end that way, and it is worth pausing on exactly why, because the reason is the hinge on which this entire story turns. An old prophecy, delivered by the ancient titan Prometheus, whom we have met before in this room chained to a mountainside for the crime of giving fire to mankind, or in some tellings by the sea god Themis herself, warned that Thetis was fated to bear a son who would grow to be far greater than his own father, a warning that meant any god who lay with her risked fathering the very child who would one day overthrow him. Exactly the pattern that had already toppled 2 entire generations of divine kings before Zeus's own reign, Uranus falling to Cronus, and Cronus falling in turn to Zeus himself. Zeus, who understood better than almost anyone alive exactly how that particular pattern worked, having lived through it personally, withdrew his own interest in Thetis immediately upon hearing the prophecy, and arranged instead, with a speed that suggests real and genuine relief, for her to be married off to a mortal man, so that whatever extraordinary child she eventually bore would be born only half a god, strong enough to be remarkable, but never strong enough to threaten Olympus itself. The mortal chosen for her was a king named Peleus, ruler of the Myrmidons in Thessaly, a man of real and celebrated virtue in his own right, one of the heroes who had sailed with Jason aboard the Argo in a voyage we have told in full on another night in this room, and it is worth pausing on how that marriage was actually arranged, because Thetis herself, by nearly every ancient account, did not want it, resenting deeply the fact that a goddess of the sea was being handed down to a mortal husband as a kind of political convenience between frightened gods rather than being permitted any real choice of her own. And she fought Peleus, quite literally, on the beach where he came to claim her, transforming herself again and again into fire, into water, into a lion, into a serpent, every shape a sea goddess could summon, trying to escape a marriage she had never consented to, until Peleus, following the advice of the wise centaur Chiron, whom we will meet again very shortly in a role that matters enormously to the rest of tonight's story, simply held on through every transformation without letting go, until Thetis, exhausted and out of forms to become, finally yielded and agreed to the marriage. It is worth pausing on that image for a moment, A goddess wrestled into a marriage she never wanted through sheer, patient physical persistence, because it tells us something true about the household Achilles was eventually born into, a marriage between an unwilling immortal mother and a mortal father who had, in the most literal sense, refused to let her go. And it is a detail this whole story is going to return to, quietly, again and again, whenever it asks why Thetis seems, throughout her son's entire life, to hover at the very edge of every scene, present and devoted and yet never quite reconciled to the mortal world her son was going to have to live and die inside. The wedding itself, once it finally happened, was celebrated on Mount Pelion with a splendour the old sources describe as unmatched by any other marriage between a god and a mortal in the whole of Greek myth, attended by nearly the entire pantheon of Olympus, the 9 muses singing, the gods themselves bringing wedding gifts of a magnificence that would matter, decades later, in ways nobody at that wedding could have foreseen, and it is worth pausing on the single guest who was not invited, because that single omission is going to set the whole rest of this story, and a great deal of another story we have already told in this room, into motion. Eris, goddess of discord and strife, was deliberately left off the guest list. Her particular gift for turning celebration into conflict considered too dangerous a risk for a gathering meant to be joyful. And Eris, arriving anyway and finding herself turned away at the threshold of a party, attended by literally every other god in existence, took her revenge in a single, small, devastatingly effective gesture, tossing among the assembled guests a golden apple inscribed with 3 words, "For the fairest," and walking away, leaving behind her an object no god in that entire glittering hall could resist claiming for themselves. It is worth pausing here, before this story turns properly to Achilles himself, on what that single apple actually set in motion, because 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena and Aphrodite, each claimed the apple as rightfully theirs, and their quarrel proved so intractable that Zeus himself, wisely refusing to judge a contest he could not possibly win without permanently alienating 2 of the 3 most powerful goddesses in his own court, handed the decision instead to a mortal shepherd on a hillside outside Troy, a young man named Paris, who chose Aphrodite's bribe of the most beautiful woman in the world over Hera's offer of political power and Athena's offer of wisdom in war, a choice that would, within a matter of years, deliver into Paris's arms a married Spartan queen named Helen, and set in motion the very war that the rest of tonight's story is going to unfold inside. We have told that particular chain of consequence in much greater detail on another night in this room, and we are not going to walk it all the way through again tonight, but it is worth naming plainly, here at the start, that the war Achilles was born to fight in was already, in a real sense, being assembled at his own parents' wedding years before he himself was even conceived. A single uninvited goddess and a single golden apple setting loose a chain of jealousy and desire that would not stop moving until an entire city had burned. It is worth pausing, briefly, on exactly what each of those 3 goddesses actually offered the young shepherd standing in judgment over them, because the specific shape of the bribe he chose tells us something worth carrying forward into the rest of tonight's story. Hera offered him kingship, dominion over the richest and broadest stretch of land any mortal king could hope to rule. Athena offered him wisdom and unmatched skill in war, the very qualities that might have let a single Trojan prince stand toe-to-toe with the Greek army's own greatest fighters. Aphrodite offered him neither land nor wisdom at all, but simply the love of the most beautiful woman then living in the whole of the world, and it is worth noting, plainly, that Paris chose the one gift among the 3 that came with no actual power attached to it whatsoever, a choice this whole tradition treats, in hindsight, as exactly the kind of decision a shallow, pleasure-seeking man would make, valuing a single woman's beauty over the strength and the wisdom that might have actually let him defend the city that beauty was about to cost. It is worth pausing, too, on a detail this whole tradition sometimes lets slip past unremarked, because Paris was not, at the time of that judgment, unattached at all, already married, in several ancient tellings, to a mountain nymph named Oenone, who loved him deeply and who possessed, fittingly enough for a story built so heavily around wounds and their healing, a genuine gift for medicine, said to be capable of curing any injury, however severe. Paris abandoned her without much apparent hesitation the moment Aphrodite's prize came within reach, and it is worth remembering her name now, because it is going to matter again, quietly, near the very end of tonight's story, in a small and bitter footnote most popular retellings leave out entirely. A newborn held by one heel, and a story that is almost certainly not true. Thetis and Peleus, once their strange and unwilling marriage had settled into something more like an ordinary household, had a son, and it is here at the very moment of his birth that the most famous single detail of this entire story enters the tradition, though it is worth being honest with you immediately about exactly how famous and exactly how late that detail actually is, because the version most people carry around in their heads today, a grieving mother dipping her infant son by one heel into the black waters of the river Styx to render every other inch of his body invulnerable to any weapon, leaving only that single heel, the one place her own hand had to hold him, mortal and vulnerable, does not actually appear anywhere in Homer, and does not appear anywhere in the whole of the surviving Greek epic tradition at all. It is worth pausing on that absence, because it matters a great deal to how we understand this story as a living, growing thing, rather than a fixed and finished text. The dipping in the Styx story, in the specific form nearly everyone alive today already knows it, comes from a Roman poet named Statius, writing an unfinished epic called the Achilles at the very end of the 1st century after Christ, more than 1,000 years after the oldest layers of the Achilles tradition had already taken shape. And it was Statius, not Homer, not any of the older Greek poets whose work survived to us only in fragments, who gave the ancient world its single most enduring image of maternal love and maternal failure combined in one small, damp gesture, a mother trying to make her son immortal and leaving, through the one unavoidable point of contact between her own hand and his own small body, the single crack through which his death would eventually enter. It is a beautiful story, and it is worth admitting plainly that it is almost certainly a later invention, layered onto a much older figure by a poet working in an entirely different empire, in an entirely different language, centuries after the war at Troy had already passed from living memory into pure legend. What Homer himself actually gives us, in the oldest and most authoritative layer of this whole tradition, is something both stranger and, in its own way, more honest. Because Homer's Achilles is not invulnerable at all, not anywhere on his body, a warrior who can be wounded, who bleeds, who fights other men on entirely mortal terms even though he happens to fight them better than any other man alive. His advantage lying not in any magical immunity to blades but in raw speed, in overwhelming strength, in a ferocity of spirit that no ordinary soldier could match, and in the simple, devastating fact of who his mother was, a goddess who could plead his case directly to the king of the gods himself whenever the war turned against him. It is worth pausing on this difference, because it changes the whole emotional shape of the story we are about to tell. A hero who cannot be hurt has no real stakes in a battle, no genuine risk, and it is worth remembering, across everything still ahead of us tonight, that Homer's Achilles is not that hero, a man who fights and could, in the oldest telling of this story, actually die from any blow that landed squarely enough, and whose eventual death, when it comes not because some later poet needed a clever loophole in an armour of invulnerability, but because that was always, from the very beginning of the oldest tradition, simply how mortal men in this war were understood to die. We're going to keep the heel later in tonight's story when we come to the actual circumstances of Achilles' death, because it is impossible at this point in history to tell this story without it, a detail so thoroughly woven into the way English speakers themselves talk about vulnerability and Achilles' heel, that setting it aside entirely would feel like a kind of dishonesty of its own. But it is worth carrying quietly underneath that familiar image the knowledge that the man the oldest poets actually sang about was vulnerable everywhere, not merely at one small unguarded point. A man whose survival through 9 years of brutal siege warfare depended on his own extraordinary skill and his own mother's extraordinary influence, rather than on any single loophole in his own flesh. And it is worth sitting for a moment with how much more frightening and how much more human that older version actually is. A boy raised on the marrow of lions. Thetis, whatever we make of the Styx story, did not raise her son alone in any ordinary household, because the old tradition tells us that Peleus, following the same wise counsel he had once used to win Thetis' own hand, sent his young son away from the royal court entirely, up into the mountains of Thessaly, to be raised by the centaur Chiron. And it is worth pausing here, because this is a name our regular listeners will already recognise from another night's story in this room, and the connection is worth drawing out plainly before we go any further. Chiron, unlike nearly every other centaur in the wider Greek tradition, creatures generally remembered as violent, lawless, and prone to uncontrollable drunkenness, was himself immortal by his own divine birth, a son of the Titan Cronus, and was renowned across the whole of Greek myth as the single wisest and gentlest teacher any hero could hope to study under, tutor across the generations to a whole roll call of the tradition's greatest names, healers and heroes and kings, a resume so distinguished that when we told in this same room the long and sorrowful story of Heracles, it was Chiron, that same gentle and immortal centaur who was struck by one of Heracles' own poisoned arrows in a chaotic, accidental brawl. A wound that could not kill an immortal being but could and did condemn him to an agony with no natural end, until Chiron finally traded away his own immortality simply to escape it, a trade taken up in most versions of that story by the suffering-chained titan Prometheus. It is worth admitting honestly, here in Achilles' own story, that these two tales do not sit easily together on any single timeline, since the same Chiron who is dying slowly of an incurable wound in one telling is very much alive and actively raising Achilles in another, and it is worth remembering, whenever this kind of overlap comes up, that we are not dealing with a single consistent history at all, but with a whole tangle of stories composed by different poets across different centuries, each one borrowing freely from a shared pool of names and figures, without much concern for whether the resulting timeline actually holds together. And it is one of the small, honest pleasures of telling these stories in this room, to let that inconsistency stand plainly rather than pretending it away. It is worth pausing too on exactly who else Chiron is said to have raised and taught across the whole span of this tradition, because it tells us something about the specific, exclusive company Achilles' own childhood placed him in. The healer god Asclepius, whose own descendants would go on to found the whole ancient tradition of Greek medicine, learned the healing arts at Chiron's own hands. Jason, who would later lead the Argo on the same voyage Peleus himself once sailed, was raised by Chiron after his own throne was stolen out from under his family. And Heracles' story, the very story we have already drawn on twice tonight, brings us back to that same mountainside more than once, since Heracles himself is said, in several tellings, to have visited and trained with Chiron long before the accidental wounding that would eventually end the old centaur's life. It is worth pausing on what it means that this whole tradition kept sending its greatest heroes back to the very same teacher, on the very same mountain, generation after generation, as though Greek myth itself understood that greatness of this particular, difficult kind could not simply be inherited or granted by birth alone, but had to be deliberately built, patiently and carefully, by someone wise enough to know exactly what a hero's life was actually going to demand of him. Chiron's household, high on the wooded slopes of Mount Pelion, was by every account a place of genuine and rigorous education, and it is worth pausing on exactly what that education actually consisted of, because it tells us something important about what the ancient world expected a truly great warrior to become. Chiron taught the young Achilles medicine, the healing use of herbs and the setting of wounds, a skill that would matter enormously later in the war, when Achilles himself treats a wounded companion on the battlefield with a knowledge no other soldier in the whole Greek camp possesses. He taught him music, the playing of the lyre, an instrument the old poems later show Achilles still practicing even in the depths of the war itself, singing to himself of the glorious deeds of earlier heroes in the quiet of his own tent, and in the detail the old sources linger on most because of how strange and how deliberate it sounds to modern ears. Chiron is said to have fed the young boy a diet built specifically around the internal organs and marrow of lions and wild boars, believing that a growing hero absorbed, quite literally, the courage and the ferocity of the animals whose flesh he consumed. A piece of ancient nutritional theory this whole tradition takes with a straight face, and one that is worth pausing on now, because it tells us that the Greeks who first told this story understood Achilles' eventual battlefield fury not as some unexplained personal flaw, but as something that had been, in the most literal sense imaginable, cultivated in him from childhood, spooned into him one meal at a time by a teacher who believed he was doing the boy a genuine kindness. It was also on Mount Pelion, according to several ancient sources, that Achilles received his own name in its earliest recorded form, and it is worth pausing briefly on the meaning scholars have long argued over, because a name that translates, by one common ancient reading, to something close to grief of the people or the people's pain, sits over this entire story like a small, quiet piece of foreshadowing, embedded directly into the hero's own identity, a warrior whose very name, centuries before he was ever born in any telling of this myth, already carried the suggestion that his life was going to be measured out in other people's sorrow as much as in his own glory, and it is worth carrying that ambiguity with you now, through everything still ahead of us tonight. Because this whole story is going to keep asking again and again exactly whose grief a single man's greatness actually costs. A kingdom of ants, and a father who waited at home for a son who never came back. It is worth pausing here before we follow Achilles any further on the actual home he was born to rule, because this whole story spends so much of its own length on foreign shores and foreign battlefields that it is easy to lose sight of the small, specific kingdom Achilles himself was choosing to give up when he chose, as we are about to see, the short and glittering life over the long and quiet one. Phthia, the kingdom Peleus ruled in the region of Thessaly in northern Greece, was no great imperial capital on the scale of Mycenae or Pylos, the sprawling gold-rich citadels whose own ruins have given modern archaeologists so much of what we actually know about this vanished Bronze Age world, but a smaller, hardier northern kingdom, and the soldiers Achilles led to Troy, drawn from that same kingdom and the surrounding region, were known by a name that has quietly slipped its way into the modern English language in a form most people who use it have never traced back to its actual source, the Myrmidons. It is worth pausing on that name, because the old sources give it an origin story worth telling in full. One version holds that the Myrmidons were descended several generations back from a great swarm of ants that the god Zeus himself transformed into men at the request of Achilles' own great-grandfather, a king named Aeacus, whose entire island kingdom had been emptied by a devastating plague until almost no one remained to work its own fields or defend its own shores, and Zeus, taking pity, is said to have watched a long column of ants marching up the trunk of a sacred oak tree and turned them, on the spot, into a whole new population of hard-working, disciplined and fiercely loyal men, ready-made citizens for a kingdom that had lost everything else. It is worth pausing on what that origin story is actually telling us about how the Myrmidons were understood by the wider Greek world that told and retold this myth, because an army descended, however fancifully, from ants was an army understood above nearly everything else for its discipline and its collective loyalty, soldiers who moved and fought as a single coordinated body rather than as a scattered collection of individual glory seekers, and it is worth noting that this same association survives quietly in the English word myrmidon itself, still used today to describe a follower who carries out orders without question or complaint, a small linguistic fossil left behind by a name, Most people who use it have never once connected to a Bronze Age kingdom in northern Greece, or to the loyal soldiers who followed one particular young commander all the way to a foreign shore and, in the case of a great many of them, never came home again. It is worth pausing too on Peleus himself, because this whole story tends to let him fade into the background the moment his son sails for Troy, and it is worth naming plainly what that fading actually cost him. Peleus was, by every account the old sources give us, a genuinely admirable man in his own right long before he ever married a goddess, one of the heroes who sailed aboard the Argo in the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts, a story we have told in full on Another Night in This Room, and a king who ruled his own smaller, harder northern kingdom with a steadiness this whole wider tradition rarely bothers to celebrate, precisely because steadiness of that kind so rarely produces the kind of dramatic, poem-worthy incident this tradition prefers. He was already growing old by the time the Greek fleet sailed for Troy, and it is worth pausing on the fact that he never once appears, in any surviving version of this story, actually witnessing a single moment of the war his own son fought and died in, an old man left behind entirely in Phthia, ruling a kingdom that had sent away its own future in the person of its only son, and waiting, across 9 long years and then a 10th, for news that could only ever be good or catastrophic, with nothing in between. It is worth remembering, when we come, later tonight, to the scene of Priam kneeling in Achilles' own tent and asking him to imagine his own father's grief, that the poem is asking us to hold 2 images side by side without ever actually showing us both of them directly. An old Trojan king who has already lost so many sons that his own grief has nowhere left to hide, kneeling in front of an enemy's tent because he has no other choice left at all, and an old Greek king, far to the north in a kingdom the poem never once takes us back to, who does not yet know, in this same scene, that his own son has only a matter of weeks left to live, and who will, when the news finally does reach him, have no enemy's tent to kneel in and no ransom to offer, only an empty hall in a kingdom he built to be handed down to a son who was never coming home to receive it. This whole story gives Priam's grief a name and a scene, and a whole night of hospitality in which to express it. It gives Peleus's grief nothing at all, no scene, no words, not even a messenger's arrival described on the page, only the certain silent knowledge available to every listener who already knows how the Two Fates thesis stated at the very outset of this whole story is going to resolve, that an old man in a northern kingdom is at some point after this story's own ending going to receive news that will end whatever peace remained to him off the page entirely, in a silence this whole tradition simply never fills, a choice laid out plainly, and a mother who could not bear to watch her son make it. It is here, in Achilles' own boyhood, still years before any war at Troy had begun to gather on the horizon, that the central bargain of this entire story enters the tradition, and it is worth pausing on it now at real length, because everything that follows tonight, every battle and every grief and every choice this man makes for the rest of his life, only makes sense once you understand the shape of the decision that was laid out in front of him. Thetis, who as a goddess possessed a foreknowledge of her son's future that no mortal parent could ever hope to match, knew 2 separate, mutually exclusive fates that stood open to her son and told him of them plainly, in words the old poem preserves with a directness this whole tradition rarely allows itself elsewhere. If Achilles remained at home in Phthia, in the safe, familiar kingdom his father ruled, he would live a long and comfortable life, marry, raise children of his own, grow old in the company of people who loved him, and die, eventually, an old man surrounded by his own family, remembered fondly by those who had actually known him but forgotten, in time, by everyone else, the way nearly every human life that has ever been lived is eventually forgotten, folded quietly back into the great anonymous mass of ordinary human experience that history simply does not have room to preserve in any individual detail. If, instead, he sailed with the Greek fleet to fight at Troy, he would win a glory. The old word for it is kleos, meaning something close to the fame that survives a person's own death, carried forward in the songs and stories told about them, so total and so bright that his name would still be spoken thousands of years later, and he would, in exchange for that undying fame, die young, on foreign soil, far from his own home and his own father, before he'd lived even half the span an ordinary life might have granted him. It is worth pausing here because this is not a decision most human beings are ever actually asked to make in anything like so stark a form, and it is worth naming plainly what kind of story we are actually inside once we understand it. This is not, at its core, a war story at all, not really, whatever its battles and its bronze-tipped spears might suggest on the surface. It is a story about the exact currency the ancient Greek world used to measure a human life. Kleos against Nostos, undying fame against the ordinary, unglamorous, deeply human wish simply to go home and grow old among the people you love, and it is a story about a young man handed both options with a clarity almost nobody else in this entire tradition is ever granted, and asked, quite literally, to choose between them. Achilles chose Troy. He chose it, in most tellings of this story, well before the war itself had even fully gathered, understanding from the very outset exactly what that choice meant, a short life in exchange for an undying name, and it is worth sitting with that decision now, at the very start of everything still to come tonight, because nearly everything Achilles does for the rest of his life, every act of extraordinary battlefield fury, and every moment of extraordinary grief has to be understood as the working out, in real and specific and often unbearable detail, of a bargain he struck with his own fate while he was still barely more than a boy. It is worth remembering too that Thetis herself never fully reconciled herself to her son's choice, appearing again and again across the whole of the story still ahead of us tonight, not as a goddess triumphant in her son's glory, but as a mother in a state of nearly constant quiet grief, watching a fate she could foresee in perfect detail arrive, inch by inch, exactly on schedule, unable for all her divine power to actually stop it, only to soften it here and there at the margins, and it is worth carrying her particular grief with you through everything still ahead of us tonight, because it is one of the quieter, sadder threads running underneath this entire glittering, violent story. A girl among the daughters of a distant king. It was precisely because Thetis could see this fate coming, clear and inevitable, that she made one last attempt, before the war had even properly begun, to keep her son away from it entirely. And it is worth pausing on this episode, because it is one of the strangest and, to modern audiences, most surprising detours in this whole tradition, a detour many popular retellings quietly skip past entirely because it does not fit the image of an unstoppable warrior quite so comfortably as the rest of the story does. When word first began to spread that a great Greek expedition was gathering to sail against Troy in retaliation for Paris's theft of Helen, and a prophecy had made clear that this particular war could not be won without Achilles' own participation, Thetis, desperate to keep her son out of a conflict she already knew would kill him, disguised him as a girl and sent him to live in secret among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros, hidden in plain sight within a royal household that had no reason to suspect one of its own young women was in fact the single most sought-after warrior in the entire Greek world. Achilles, by most tellings still young enough at this point that the disguise was genuinely convincing, lived among Lycomedes' daughters for some considerable stretch of time, and it is worth pausing on the fact that this was not, in the story's own telling, a brief or a merely comic episode, because Achilles, during his time on Skyros, formed a real and lasting relationship with one of those daughters, a young woman named Deidamia, a relationship that produced a son, Neoptolemus, who would grow up never having properly known his own father, and who would nonetheless, years later, be summoned to Troy himself to help finish the very war his father had begun, a detail we will return to before tonight's story is through. It is worth pausing briefly on Deidamia herself, because this whole episode tends to be told, in most popular retellings, purely for its own comic value, a famous warrior awkwardly disguised in women's clothing, and that comic framing leaves almost no room at all for what the episode actually cost the one person left behind once Odysseus's trick succeeded, and Achilles, sword and shield finally in hand, sailed away to a war she had no part in and no say over. A young woman left alone with an infant son and a husband, in whatever sense that word actually applied to their own brief time together, who was never coming back. One more quiet grief. This whole tradition tucks into the margins of a story it would rather tell as adventure. The Greek leadership, meanwhile, could not simply sail without him, because the same prophecy that had marked Achilles for an early death had also marked him as indispensable to victory, and it fell in most versions of this story to the same clever man whose own long and cunning voyage home from this same war we have followed across several separate nights in this room, Odysseus, to track the missing hero down. Odysseus, arriving at the court of Lycomdes disguised as a travelling merchant, laid out before the assembled young women of the household a tempting display of fine cloth, jewellery and ornaments, exactly the sort of goods a merchant might reasonably offer to a royal household's daughters, but concealed among that display deliberately was a sword and a shield, and Odysseus had arranged at the same moment the young women were examining his wares for a trumpet to be sounded outside mimicking the sudden alarm of an attack, and it is worth pausing on what happened next, because it is one of the cleverest and most quietly devastating character tests in the whole of Greek myth. Every one of Lycomedes' actual daughters reacted exactly as any young woman raised at court might be expected to react to a sudden alarm of danger, fleeing or gathering their fine cloth protectively to themselves. While the young woman among them who was, in fact, Achilles in disguise, reached instinctively and without a moment's hesitation for the sword and the shield instead, a warrior's reflex breaking through a disguise no ordinary observation could have pierced, and in that single unguarded instant, Odysseus knew he had found the man he had come for. It is worth pausing on this whole episode for a moment longer, because it tells us something important about the shape of the rest of this story that is easy to miss if we rush past it toward the more famous battles still ahead of us tonight. Achilles offered by his own mother a genuine chance to disappear from this particular fate entirely, to live out a quiet, disguised, entirely different life on a small island far from any battlefield, was drawn back toward the war not by any external force at all, but by something innate in his own nature, a reflex reaching for a sword before his own conscious mind had even fully processed the alarm. And it is worth holding that detail alongside the two fates choice we discussed a moment ago, because it suggests that whatever conscious bargain Achilles struck with his own destiny, there was also something underneath the choice, something closer to instinct than to decision, that was always going to carry him towards this particular war regardless of what his mother arranged around him. Thetis's disguise delayed the inevitable. It did not in the end prevent it, and it is worth carrying that small sequel of failure with us as we now turn at last toward the gathering of the great fleet itself, and toward the first and perhaps the cruelest of all the costs this particular war would demand before a single Greek soldier had even set foot on Trojan soil. A fleet becalmed, and a daughter offered under false pretenses. The full Greek expedition against Troy, once Achilles had been found and persuaded to join it, gathered at a harbour called Aulis, an enormous coalition of contingents from across nearly the entire Greek world, led in overall command by Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and the brother of Helen's own abandoned husband Menelaus, a man whose relationship with Achilles is going to matter enormously to everything still ahead of us tonight, and it is worth pausing here, before the fleet even properly sails, on an episode that most popular retellings of this story either soften considerably or leave out entirely, because it establishes, before the war has even truly begun, exactly the kind of commander Achilles was going to spend the following 9 years serving under, and exactly the kind of moral compromise this entire war was going to demand of nearly everyone involved in it. The fleet at Aulis found itself becalmed, held in the harbour for days and then weeks by an utter absence of wind that no ordinary sailing could overcome, and the seer Calchas, consulted about the cause of this unnatural delay, revealed that Agamemnon himself had given offence to the goddess Artemis, in most tellings by boasting in a moment of careless pride that his own skill as a hunter exceeded the goddess's own, and that the only remedy the goddess would accept was the sacrifice of Agamemnon's own daughter, a young woman named Iphigenia, upon an altar at Aulis itself, a demand so monstrous that Agamemnon, by every honest account of this episode, wrestled with it in genuine anguish before finally, weighing his own daughter's life against the command of an entire army and the political and military weight of the whole expedition he had assembled, choosing to go through with it. It's worth pausing on the specific methods by which Iphigenia was actually brought to Aulis, because it is here that Achilles' own name enters this particular episode, entirely without his own knowledge or consent, and it is worth naming plainly how badly he was used in the process. Agamemnon, needing some pretext to bring his own daughter to the harbour without alerting her or her mother, Clytemnestra, to the true and horrifying purpose of the summons, sent word home that Iphigenia was to be brought to Aulis at once to be married, and the husband named in that false summons was Achilles himself, the single most celebrated young warrior in the entire assembled Greek army, a match any royal family in the Greek world would have considered a genuine honour, and Iphigenia and her mother travelled to Aulis in good faith, believing they were arriving for a joyous wedding, only to discover once there the true and unbearable purpose of the summons, a discovery made all the more devastating by the fact that the young man whose name had been used to lure them there had, by most tellings of this episode, no idea whatsoever that his own identity was being used as bait for a killing he had never agreed to and would never have condoned. It is worth pausing at real length on what happened when Achilles himself learned how he had been used, because several ancient tellings of this episode, most fully developed in a tragedy by Euripides staged in Athens generations after the oldest layers of this story had already taken shape, show him reacting with a fury that is worth holding in your mind for the rest of tonight's story, because it is the very first appearance, chronologically within the tale itself, of the same volcanic temper that is going to define nearly everything Achilles does once the war itself actually begins. In Euripides' own version, Achilles, confronting Agamemnon and the whole assembled Greek command once the plot against Iphigenia's own life had come to light, offers in a genuine and furious act of protection to defend her with his own sword against the entire army if it comes to that, understanding with real clarity that his own name and his own honour had been stolen and used as an instrument in a plan to murder an innocent young woman he had never even met. A violation of exactly the kind of personal honour, time in the old Greek word, that this whole story is going to show us, again and again, Achilles caring about more fiercely than he cares about almost anything else in his own life. It is worth pausing too on what actually happened to Iphigenia herself in the versions of this story that do not simply end with her death on the altar, because it is one of the small mercies this ancient tradition occasionally allows itself. Several tellings, including Euripides' own second and later treatment of this same story, show Artemis herself intervening at the very last moment, snatching Iphigenia away from the altar and substituting a deer in her place, carrying the young woman off to serve as a priestess in a distant land instead of allowing her actual death to occur, a rescue that Clytemnestra herself in most tellings is never told about, left to believe for the rest of her own life that her daughter had genuinely died at her own husband's command, a grief that would fester, unresolved, for the entire 9 years of the war still ahead of us, and that would eventually, when Agamemnon at last returned home from Troy, come due in the most violent way imaginable, a story we may well tell in full on another night in this room. Whether Iphigenia lived or died in whichever version you happen to prefer, It is worth pausing on the plain fact that her fate, one way or the other, was decided entirely by men weighing the success of a military campaign against a single young woman's life, and that Achilles' own name, entirely without his knowledge, was made complicit in that calculation before he had ever raised a sword against a single Trojan soldier. A first, uncomfortable lesson in exactly what kind of moral compromises this particular war was going to demand of everyone it touched, himself very much included. Once the wind had at last returned, whether through Artemis' satisfaction at the completed sacrifice or her mercy in substituting a deer, the great fleet finally sailed from Aulis, more than 1,000 ships by the count later, poets would settle on, carrying an army drawn from nearly every corner of the Greek world towards a city on the coast of Asia Minor that most of the men aboard those ships had never seen, and would, in the case of a great many of them, never live to see leave again. It's worth pausing briefly on how the Iliad itself chooses to actually account for a fleet this enormous, because the poem pauses too, devoting a long, careful stretch of its own second book to what later readers came to call the Catalogue of Ships, a formal region-by-region roll call naming the specific contingents that sailed from every corner of the Greek world, their own kings and captains named individually, their own home cities listed by name, a passage modern readers often find themselves skimming past, but that ancient audiences plainly valued enough to preserve intact across 4 centuries of oral transmission. And it is worth pausing on why, because a catalogue like this one served this whole tradition as something closer to a shared genealogical record than a simple list, letting any given listener, in any given city across the wider Greek world, listen for their own home's own name among the assembled contingents and hear their own ancestors, real or claimed, folded directly into the single most important shared story their entire culture told about itself. Achilles himself commanded, by that same catalogue's own count, 50 ships from Phthia and the surrounding region, a modest contingent by comparison with some of the larger kingdoms represented in that same list. A reminder, worth holding on to, that his own outsized fame in this story was never actually a matter of commanding the largest army on that beach, but of what he alone, among every other captain in that entire fleet, was capable of doing once armour was on his back and a spear was in his hand. It is worth pausing briefly on the city itself before the fighting properly begins, because Troy the poem describes to us is no ordinary settlement but a genuinely formidable capital, ringed by walls the tradition itself insists were raised in part by the god Poseidon's own hands, tall enough and thick enough that 9 full years of siege by the largest army the Bronze Age Aegean had ever assembled could not breach them by direct assault, entered through several great gates, the most famous of them the Scaean Gate, where so many of this whole story's most important scenes, Hector's farewell to Andromache among them, are staged. Priam himself ruled a household on a scale that matches the city's own famous wealth. 50 sons by several different wives and concubines, the poem tells us, each with his own polished chamber built onto the royal palace, and 12 married daughters. Besides, a household so large that its own eventual destruction, when it finally came extinguished in a single night, nearly an entire generation of one of the wealthiest ruling families the ancient Aegean world had ever produced. It is worth holding that scale in mind across everything still ahead of us tonight, because it means the individual deaths this story lingers over, Hector's and later Achilles' own, were never simply personal losses but the slow grinding attrition of an entire royal house, one son and one ally at a time, until almost nothing of it remained to inherit whatever the city itself still had left to lose. 9 years of raiding, a young prince at a fountain, and a war that had not yet properly begun. It is worth pausing here, before we move into the events the Iliad itself actually narrates, on a stretch of this whole story that most popular retellings skip past entirely, because the famous poem that gives us nearly everything we know about Achilles' own temper and his own rage does not in fact cover the whole 10 years of the war at all, picking up its own narrative only in the final weeks of the 9th year of the siege, which means that an enormous stretch of this war, 9 full years of it, happened before the story most people actually know even begins, and Achilles spent a great deal of that unrecorded stretch not besieging Troy's own walls directly at all, since the city itself proved far too well defended to be taken by direct assault, but raiding the smaller cities and territories allied with Troy across the surrounding region, a long, grinding, unglamorous campaign of attrition meant to starve the city of its allies and its resources before any final assault could ever hope to succeed. It was during these 9 years of raiding that Achilles is said, in fragments of the wider tradition surrounding the Iliad, to have sacked a great many cities along the coast of Asia Minor, and it is worth pausing on one particular episode from this period, because it connects directly to the final and most devastating stretch of tonight's story, an episode involving a young Trojan prince named Troilus, one of Priam's own many sons, said in several ancient sources to be so beautiful and so beloved that an old prophecy held Troy itself could never fall so long as Troilus lived to see his 20th year. Achilles, whether acting on knowledge of that prophecy or simply through the grim opportunism of a long siege, ambushed the young prince at a fountain outside the city walls where Troilus had gone, in the gentlest and most ordinary version of this story, simply to water his own horses, and killed him there, cutting short in a single act of calculated violence both a young man's own life and the specific hope the prophecy had attached to it. It is worth pausing on this episode for a moment, because ancient vase painters return to the killing of Troilus again and again across the centuries, more often, by some counts, than almost any other single scene from the entire war, and it is worth naming plainly why that particular popularity is worth pausing on, because there is very little glory in it. An armed and famously invincible warrior cutting down an unarmed, still-growing boy at a fountain outside his own city's walls, an act this tradition does not dress up in any of the ceremonial language it reserves for Achilles' later, more evenly matched combats. It is worth holding this episode alongside everything still ahead of us tonight, because it complicates, in a way this whole story rarely allows itself to complicate anything about its central hero. The image of Achilles as a figure of pure, admirable battlefield glory, reminding us instead that 9 years of siege warfare against a whole city and its allied territories produced inevitably a great deal of violence that had nothing noble or evenly matched about it at all. Violence visited on people like Troilus, who had done nothing more than exist on the wrong side of a war that had never been theirs to start. It was also during these same 9 years of raiding that Achilles captured 2 young women whose names are going to matter enormously to everything still ahead of us tonight, taking a city called Lyrnessus and carrying off from it a woman named Briseis, and taking, in a separate raid, a woman named Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo named Chrysis. It is worth pausing on Briseis' own life before that capture, because the poem does not let us forget it entirely, even in the middle of a quarrel that treats her, so much of the time, as little more than a disputed prize, telling us plainly that she had already been a married woman, the wife of a man named Mines, a prince of Lyrnessus, and that Achilles himself, in the very same raid that carried her off, had killed her husband along with her 3 brothers, so that the woman 2 of the most powerful men in the entire Greek army are about to quarrel over, so bitterly had already lost in a single afternoon every single man in her own household to the man who then claimed her as his own reward, a fact this whole story asks us to hold quietly in mind every time it later describes her, in the flatter language of prize and property, as belonging to anyone at all. Both women were awarded, according to the customary division of plunder this whole army operated under, as prizes of honour, geras in the old Greek term, tangible proof of a warrior's own battlefield achievement distributed among the army's leading men, in rough proportion to their own contribution and standing. It is worth pausing here on exactly what that word Geras actually meant in this world, because it is going to matter enormously to the quarrel that opens the Iliad itself, a quarrel that can look, to modern eyes unfamiliar with the specific honour culture this whole army operated inside, like an argument over property, but that meant something far more consequential to the men actually living inside it. Because a warrior's prize was not merely a possession in this world, it was a visible, public measure of his own worth relative to every other man in the army, and to have one's prize taken away by a rival, however powerful that rival might be, was to have one's own honour publicly and deliberately diminished in front of the very army, whose respect a warrior like Achilles had staked his entire, short, chosen life on earning. It's worth pausing too, before we let this 9-year stretch of raiding pass, on the two women themselves, Briseis and Chryseis, because it is worth naming plainly and holding on to something this whole story does not always pause long enough to say clearly. These were not objects passing between men in some abstract transaction of honour, however the old poem's own language sometimes frames them, but women whose entire lives had just been violently and irrevocably altered, their cities burned. In all likelihood, their own families killed in the same raids that captured them, carried off to serve, in whatever capacity their captors decided, inside the tents of the very men responsible for destroying everything they had previously known. And it is worth remembering across everything still ahead of us tonight, that the coming quarrel between Achilles and his own commander, however much both men frame it in the language of insulted honour, is a quarrel being fought entirely over the fate of a woman who has no voice at all in how that quarrel gets resolved. One more small, quiet injustice, folded into a war that this whole tradition, honest at its best moments about exactly this kind of imbalance, does not let us forget entirely, even if it does not dwell on it nearly as long as it dwells on the wounded pride of the men doing the actual fighting. It is worth pausing too on exactly how large this 9-year campaign of raiding actually was, because Achilles himself, much later in the story, in a speech that will occupy us at real length before tonight is through, gives us a number worth taking seriously. 11 cities taken by land, he tells us, and 12 more by sea, 23 separate communities across the region surrounding Troy sacked, burned or forced into submission over the course of those same 9 unrecorded years, a tally that means the war most people picture when they imagine the Trojan War, 10 years of a single army camped outside a single city's walls, is not actually an accurate picture of what those years actually look like at all, since the great majority of that decade was spent not besieging Troy directly, but grinding down city by city every smaller community in the surrounding region that might otherwise have supplied Troy with food, with soldiers, or with simple hope. It is worth pausing at real length on one of those 23 cities in particular, because its sack connects directly, in a way this whole tradition rarely lets us forget once we know to look for it, to the very duel this whole story is building toward tonight. Among the cities Achilles destroyed in these raids was Thebe, a city at the foot of Mount Placus ruled by a king named Eetion, and it is worth naming plainly who that king actually was, because Eetion was the father of Andromache, the woman who had become Hector's own wife, and Achilles, in that single raid, killed Eetion himself in single combat, and then, in a detail the old poem gives us directly from Andromache's own mouth, much later in the story, chose not to strip the fallen king's armour as plunder in the ordinary way, but to burn his body and raise a proper burial mound over him, a gesture of real and unusual respect toward a man he had just killed, and one that the mountain nymphs themselves, the poem tells us, honoured afterward by planting elm trees around his tomb. It is worth pausing too on what else that same raid cost Andromache, because Achilles killed, in that same campaign, all 7 of her own brothers as well, cut down in a single day while tending their own father's flocks and herds, so thoroughly that Andromache herself, by the time she appears later in this story pleading with her own husband not to leave her a widow, has already lost her entire birth family, every single one of them, to the very man whose son will one day help finish the war that took Hector from her too. It is worth sitting with that connection for a long moment, because it means that when Achilles and Hector finally meet outside the walls of Troy, in the confrontation this whole night's story has been building steadily toward, they are not simply two soldiers on opposite sides of an abstract war, but two men whose families have already been bound together by grief in ways neither of them, in the heat of that particular afternoon, has any time left to consider. One man about to make a widow of a woman whose entire birth family he had already destroyed years before, in a raid so far outside the poem's own main narrative that most retellings of this story never mention it at all. It is worth pausing briefly on what the ordinary texture of these 9 years of raiding must actually have looked like from inside the Greek camp itself, because the poem gives us, scattered across its own many thousands of lines, small, vivid details of an army settled in for what had clearly become, by its 10th year, something closer to a permanent semi-fortified town than a temporary military camp, ships drawn up and turned, over the years, into something closer to houses, their own black hulls providing shelter and shade, cooking fires burning along a beach that stretched for what the poem calls the length of the whole assembled fleet, herds of captured cattle and sheep, driven in from the surrounding raids and kept penned near the shore, and a whole informal settlement of captive women, taken exactly the way Briseis and Chryseis had been taken, grinding grain and weaving cloth and cooking meals for an army that had, by this point, spent nearly a full decade of its own collective life camped on a single foreign beach, waiting for a single city's walls to finally come down. A plague sent by an insulted god, and the quarrel that gives this whole war its name. We arrive now at last at the very opening of the Iliad itself, in the 10th and final year of the siege, and it is worth pausing on the poem's own remarkable choice of where to actually begin its story, because a poet setting out to tell the tale of an entire 10-year war might reasonably be expected to start at the beginning, with Helen and Paris and the gathering of the fleet at Ulis, and instead the Iliad opens in the war's final weeks, with a single quarrel between two men on the same side, and builds its entire epic scope, not around the war against Troy at all, but around the wrath of one Greek warrior against his own commander, a choice of subject the poem announces in its very first word, a word that, translated directly, simply means rage, or wrath, sung, the old poem tells us, by a goddess through the mouth of the poet, the wrath of Achilles. The quarrel begins with Chryseis, the captive priest's daughter we met a moment ago, who had been awarded as a prize of honour not to Achilles but to Agamemnon himself, the supreme commander of the entire Greek expedition. Her father, Chryseis, a priest of the god Apollo, came to the Greek camp with a generous ransom, hoping to buy his daughter's freedom back, and was refused, harshly and publicly, by Agamemnon, who declared, in front of the whole assembled army, that he preferred to keep Chryseis in his own tent, rather than return her to her father for any price, a refusal so cruel and so publicly delivered that the old priest, humiliated and grieving, walked away from the Greek camp along the shore of the sea and prayed to his own god for vengeance. And Apollo, hearing that prayer, answered it, descending from Olympus in a fury the old poem describes with an almost audible dread, his arrows in this single devastating image, making a sound like the string of a silver bow being plucked with each shot, striking down first the army's mules and dogs, and then, over 9 days of mounting horror, the Greek soldiers themselves, a plague spreading through the entire camp that no ordinary remedy could touch. It is worth pausing briefly on Agamemnon's own side of this particular decision, because this whole story is careful, at its best moments, to avoid turning any single man into a pure villain, and it is worth extending that same fairness to him here, even knowing everything his own choices are about to cost. Agamemnon was not, in his own mind, simply being cruel for cruelty's own sake, and the old poem lets him say so plainly, telling the assembled army that he genuinely preferred Chryseis to his own wife Clytemnestra, waiting for him at home in Mycenae, praising the captive woman's own beauty and her own skill and her own character in terms that suggest a man who had, in whatever limited and self-serving way this world permitted, come to actually value her presence rather than treating her as pure disposable plunder. It is worth naming plainly that this in no way excuses what came next, a refusal that endangered an entire army rather than release one woman he had no rightful claim to keep against her own father's wishes. But it is worth holding on to the fact that Agamemnon's own cruelty here was not cartoonish or simple, but the ordinary, recognisable cruelty of a powerful man who had convinced himself that his own wants were reason enough to override anyone else's, a smaller and more human failing than outright villainy, and, in its own way, a more uncomfortable one to sit with. It was Achilles, and it is worth pausing on this detail because it establishes something important about his own character before the quarrel itself even begins, who called an assembly of the whole army on the 10th day of the plague and demanded that someone, seer or priest or dream interpreter, explain plainly what had caused this disaster and how it might be ended, a demand that took real courage to make, because the seer Calchas, once persuaded to speak, made clear that he could not reveal the truth without protection from whatever powerful man's anger the truth was likely to provoke, and Achilles, publicly and without hesitation, promised that protection, swearing that so long as he himself lived and could see the light of the sun, no man in the entire army would lay a hand on Calchas for speaking honestly, a promise that meant, once Calchas did speak, and revealed that the plague was Apollo's punishment for Agamemnon's own refusal to ransom Chryseis, Achilles had effectively committed himself to defending a man who was about to deliver, in front of the whole army, a public and humiliating rebuke to the single most powerful commander in the entire expedition. Agamemnon, forced by the plague and by the whole army's own mounting fury to give up Chryseis and return her to her father, agreed to do so, but not without exacting a price, and it is worth pausing on exactly how he chose to exact it, because it is the single decision that sets everything still ahead of us tonight into motion. Rather than absorbing the loss of his own prize quietly, Agamemnon announced, in front of the entire assembled army, that he would take a replacement prize from among the other Greek leaders, and named, specifically and with what the old poem frames as calculated cruelty, Briseis, Achilles' own captured prize of honour, as the woman he intended to take in Chryseis' place. A decision that meant Achilles, the single most valuable warrior in the entire Greek army, the man whose own participation and old prophecy had declared essential to the war's success, was about to be publicly stripped of his own honour by his own supreme commander, in front of the very soldiers whose respect his whole, chosen, short life had been staked on earning. It is worth pausing at real length on what Achilles actually did in response, because the poem itself pauses there too, giving us one of the most psychologically vivid scenes in the whole of ancient literature, a warrior standing in the middle of a full military assembly, his hand actually moving toward the hilt of his own sword, weighing in the space of a few genuinely uncertain seconds whether to draw that sword and kill his own supreme commander on the spot, a decision that would have ended the war before it had even properly reached its climax, and very possibly ended Achilles' own life along with it, before the goddess Athena, sent by Hera and visible in this scene to Achilles alone among the assembled crowd, seized him by his own golden hair and held him back, counselling him toward words rather than violence, a divine intervention that saved Agamemnon's life in that single instant, but did nothing at all to cool the fury now boiling in Achilles' own chest. It is worth pausing on what Athena actually said to him in that moment, because the exchange tells us something important about the specific bargain this whole story keeps circling back to. She told him plainly that she'd come down from Olympus, at Hera's own bidding, because both goddesses loved and cared for both men equally, and wished to see this quarrel end without bloodshed, and she promised him, in exchange for his own restraint, that a day was coming when gifts 3 times as rich as anything Agamemnon had already taken from him would be laid at his own feet in atonement, urging him to master his own anger and wait for that promised reckoning rather than seizing a smaller, bloodier justice in this single instant. Achilles, the poem tells us, answered that a man had to obey the will of the gods, however heavy his own heart, since a man who did so would find the gods listening to him in turn when his own need was greatest. And he thrust his great sword back into its sheath, his hand obeying the goddess, though his own fury remained entirely unspent, a small, telling detail worth holding on to, because it means the rage that drives the rest of this whole story was never actually resolved in this scene at all, only delayed, redirected from a sword thrust into a public denunciation, and a vow of withdrawal that would, in the end, cost this same army considerably more than a single dead commander ever could have. What followed instead of a sword was something almost worse for the Greek army's own long-term prospects, because Achilles, restraining his own hand but not his own tongue, delivered a public denunciation of Agamemnon so total and so devastating that the two men's alliance never fully recovered from it, calling his own commander, in words the old poem preserves with real relish, a man with the face of a dog and the heart of a deer, a coward who let others do the actual fighting, while he himself claimed the greatest share of the plunder, and declaring, in the single most consequential vow of this entire war, that he would withdraw himself and his own formidable contingent of Myrmidon soldiers from the fighting entirely, refusing to lift a single spear on the Greek army's behalf for as long as this particular insult to his own honour went unanswered. A withdrawal that meant the single most devastating warrior in the entire expedition was about to sit out the war's final and most desperate stretch, precisely at the moment the Greek army could least afford to lose him. It is worth pausing briefly on how strange this whole scene would have looked to an outside observer entirely unfamiliar with the specific honour culture this whole army operated inside, because from any distance at all, the actual practical stakes of the quarrel look genuinely small. One captive woman, already promised generous compensation, reassigned from one wealthy warrior's tent to another's, and yet that same small transaction was enough to make the single greatest fighter in the entire Greek world consider murdering his own commander on the spot, and then withdraw an entire army's worth of fighting strength rather than accept the insult quietly. And it is worth sitting with that disproportion for a moment, because it tells us something true about how fragile and how consuming a warrior culture built entirely around public, visible honour actually was. A system in which a man's own sense of his own worth depended so completely on the world's outward recognition of it that a single public slight, however small the material stakes attached to it, could feel, to the man suffering it, indistinguishable from having his own worth as a person erased altogether. Agamemnon, for his own part, refused to back down either, sending his own heralds to Achilles' tent to formally claim Briseis and carry her away. And it is worth pausing on how the poem handles this single transfer, because it gives Achilles a genuine moment of restraint that is easy to miss amid all the surrounding fury, receiving the heralds not with violence, understanding clearly that they themselves bore no personal responsibility for their commander's decision, but with a grief the old poem describes as walking him away from the camp entirely, down to the shore of the grey sea where he sat alone and wept, stretching his own hands out over the water and calling on his mother. And it is worth pausing on that image for a long moment. The greatest warrior in the entire Greek world, a man capable of turning back entire armies single-handed, sitting on a beach in tears like a small child, because it tells us something the rest of tonight's story is going to keep insisting on, that Achilles' rage and Achilles' grief were never, in this story, two separate emotions at war with one another, but the very same wound, expressing itself first as fury and then, when the fury found nowhere left to go, as sorrow. Thetis rose from the depths of the sea at her son's call, exactly as she always did whenever his own grief grew too large to carry alone, and heard the whole story of the insult Agamemnon had delivered, and Achilles, in this scene, asked something of his own mother that would prove to be the single most consequential request of the entire war, begging her to go to Zeus himself, whose favour she had once earned by helping to defend him during an old rebellion among the gods, and asked the king of Olympus to grant victory to the Trojans for as long as it took the Greek army to recognise exactly how much they needed Achilles, a request born entirely out of wounded pride, but one that would, once Zeus agreed to it, cost an almost unbearable number of Greek lives before it was finally undone, and it is worth carrying that request with you now, because it means that everything catastrophic still ahead of us tonight, every Greek soldier who dies in the fighting still to come, dies in a real sense, because one man's honour had been publicly wounded, and he chose, in the heat of that wound, to make an entire army pay the price of restoring it. An embassy sent by night, and a hero who refuses every gift the world can offer, with Achilles and his Myrmidons withdrawn entirely from the fighting, and Zeus, true to the promise he had made Thetis, now tilting the battle steadily in Troy's favour. The war turned catastrophically against the Greeks, and it is worth pausing briefly on just how catastrophic that turn actually became, because within days the Trojan forces, led by Hector, Priam's own eldest son and the single greatest warrior on the Trojan side, had driven the Greek army all the way back to the beach where their own ships were drawn up, breaching the defensive wall the Greeks had only recently built, and setting fire, in the fighting's most desperate hour, to one of the ships themselves, a disaster that would have ended the entire expedition in ruin, stranding the whole Greek army on a hostile shore with no way home had the fire not been put out in time. It is worth pausing briefly on whose idea the embassy actually was, because the poem is specific about it, and the specificity matters. It was Nestor, the oldest and most experienced of all the Greek commanders, a man who had already, by his own frequent reminders to anyone still willing to listen, outlived 2 full generations of other heroes, who rose in the desperate council Agamemnon called that same night and said plainly what everyone else in the tent had been too proud or too frightened to say first, that the whole disaster now unfolding on the beach traced back to a single afternoon's insult, and that the only remedy left worth trying was an honest apology, backed by gifts substantial enough to prove it was genuine, carried to Achilles' own tent by men he actually respected. It is worth pausing too on the walk those 3 envoys actually took to reach him, along the same dark shore where the burning ship had only recently been fought back from total loss, past the black hulls of 1,000 other ships drawn up in their long familiar rows, the whole desperate, exhausted camp behind them, until they reached the more isolated cluster of tents where Achilles and his own Myrmidons had made their camp, apart in every sense from the army whose fate the rest of that night's council had just spent so many anxious hours debating. They found him, the poem tells us, not sharpening a spear or brooding in silence, but playing a clear-toned lyre, singing to himself in the privacy of his own tent of the glorious deeds of the heroes who had come before him, with Patroclus sitting quietly across from him, waiting for his own turn to sing once his friend had finished. A small, unguarded, almost domestic scene, 2 friends passing a quiet evening in each other's company, that the 3 envoys interrupted with the whole weight of the army's desperation. And it is worth pausing on that image for a moment, because it is one of the last entirely peaceful scenes these 2 men are ever going to share in the whole of this story. And it is worth noticing that Achilles, seeing his old comrades approaching, rose at once, set the lyre aside without complaint, and welcomed them warmly, ordering wine mixed and meat roasted for them with his own hands, the fury he had directed at Agamemnon apparently costing his old friends nothing at all of his own personal hospitality, a distinction this whole story keeps drawing carefully, again and again, between the specific target of Achilles' own rage and everyone standing outside of it. It was in the depths of this crisis, with the war teetering on the very edge of total Greek defeat, that Agamemnon, humbled at last by exactly the catastrophe Achilles' own withdrawal had been designed to produce, sent a formal embassy to Achilles' own tent. And it is worth pausing on who exactly he chose to send, because the composition of that embassy tells us something important about who in this whole army actually commanded Achilles' own respect. Odysseus went, the same clever, persuasive man whose own long voyage home we have followed, across so many nights in this room, chosen precisely for his legendary skill with words. Ajax went too, the single largest and physically strongest warrior in the entire Greek army apart from Achilles himself, a blunt, honest soldier whose own straightforward appeal to simple loyalty and friendship would carry a very different weight than Odysseus's practiced eloquence. And Phoenix went as well, an old man who had served as Achilles' own tutor, and something close to a second father during his boyhood, sent specifically to appeal not to Achilles the warrior, but to Achilles the son, the ward, the boy Phoenix himself had once carried on his own knee. Agamemnon, along with the embassy, sent an offer of gifts so extraordinary that the old poem lists them out at real length. 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 gleaming cauldrons, 12 prize-winning horses, 7 skilled women taken from a captured city, and, most significantly of all, Briseis herself, restored, along with a solemn oath that Agamemnon had never touched her, plus the promise, once Troy itself finally fell, of a share of the city's plunder greater than any other single warrior would receive, and, beyond even that, the offer of marriage to one of Agamemnon's own 3 daughters, with a dowry of 7 entire cities, an offer so lavish that any ordinary warrior in that entire army would have accepted it without a second thought. Restoration of honour, wealth, beyond counting, and a marriage alliance that would have secured Achilles' own family's fortune for generations to come. Achilles refused it, and it is worth pausing on the refusal at real length, because the speech he delivers in response is, by the judgment of a great many readers across nearly 3,000 years, the single most important passage in the entire poem, a moment in which Achilles steps back, for the first time in this whole story, from the specific insult that started this quarrel and confronts something much larger and much darker underneath it, the entire value system, kleos and honour and glory, that this whole war and this whole army and, in a real sense, his own entire chosen life had been built around. He tells Odysseus, in words the old poem preserves in full, that he hates, like the very gates of the underworld itself, a man who says one thing while hiding another in his heart, and that no gift, however lavish, could actually restore what had genuinely been taken from him, because the wound was never really about the gifts or even about Briseis herself, but about the plain, unbearable fact that a commander he had risked his own short, chosen life to serve had treated him publicly as though his contribution meant nothing at all. And then, in the section of this speech that reaches furthest beyond the immediate quarrel, Achilles lays out for Odysseus and for us, the 2 fates' choice we discussed earlier tonight, in its fullest and most devastating form, telling his old comrade plainly that his own mother has told him he carries 2 possible destinies toward his own death, and that if he stays here and fights at Troy, his own homecoming is lost forever, but his glory will be undying, while if he sails home instead, his own noble glory will be lost, but he will live a long life and death will not come for him quickly. And then, in the single line that has haunted readers of this poem for nearly 3,000 years, he tells Odysseus that he is inclined, in this moment, to advise every other Greek soldier still fighting at Troy to sail home too, because Troy is not, in the end, worth what it is costing to take. And because he has come to believe, in the depths of this particular grief, that a single day of a living man's life outweighs, in real terms, all the cattle and gold and glory that Troy or any other city could ever offer in exchange for it. It is worth pausing here at real length, because this single speech marks the moment Achilles' own story stops being a simple tale about wounded pride and becomes something far stranger and far more radical, a moment in which the single greatest warrior in this entire tradition looks directly at the value system that has organised his own entire chosen existence. Kleos purchased at the cost of a life, and finds himself for one genuine and unresolved moment doubting whether the purchase was actually worth what it cost. He does not in the end sail home, and it is worth being honest about why not, because the poem itself never gives us a fully satisfying answer, offering instead a man caught between a conviction he has just spoken aloud and a fate he has already chosen and cannot fully unchoose, a contradiction this whole tradition leaves standing unresolved exactly the way real grief and real anger so often refuse to resolve themselves into anything as clean as a single consistent position. Phoenix speaking next tried a different and gentler appeal entirely, reminding Achilles of his own childhood, of the years Phoenix himself had spent, raising him almost as his own son, and warning him through the old story of a hero named Meleager, who once withdrew from a battle in a fit of wounded pride much like Achilles' own, and returned too late to claim any reward for his eventual help, that a man who waits too long to relent in his own anger often finds, when he finally does relent, that the moment for glory and gratitude has already passed him by, a warning that would prove before this night's story is finished to be almost unbearably prophetic. And Ajax, last of the three, appealed not to gifts or to old stories at all, but to the simplest and most direct claim of all, that Achilles' own comrades, men who had fought and bled and eaten alongside him for 9 long years, deserved better than to be abandoned to slaughter over a quarrel about a single captive woman, a plain, blunt appeal to ordinary human loyalty that came in the end closer than either of the other two men's words to actually moving Achilles, who conceded that he would not rejoin the fighting yet, but would not, either, allow the ships to be burned so long as Hector himself had not yet reached his own tent directly, a small grudging concession that offered the desperate Greek army almost nothing at all in practical terms, and the 3 envoys returned to Agamemnon's own tent that same night with their mission, by any honest measure, a total failure. A friend borrows another man's armour and pays the full price of it. It is here, with the embassy's failure hanging over the whole Greek camp, that the story turns at last toward the 2 deaths that everything in this entire tale has been quietly building toward, and it is worth pausing, before we reach them, on the man whose death is actually going to matter most to everything still ahead of us tonight, because Patroclus, Achilles' own closest companion, has been present throughout this entire story so far, and yet has said and done relatively little of his own until this exact moment. A quiet, steady presence at Achilles' own side since childhood. When the 2 of them had been raised together, in most tellings, after Patroclus, having accidentally killed another boy in a childhood quarrel over a game of dice, was sent by his own father to be fostered in Peleus' own household, where he and Achilles grew up together as close as brothers, a closeness this whole story is now, at last, about to make devastatingly clear. A love the ancient world itself argued about. It is worth pausing here, before we follow that closeness into the grief that is about to define the rest of this story. On a question later Greek audiences themselves argued over openly, and one this channel does not think it would be honest to skip past, because the exact nature of the bond between Achilles and Patroclus has been debated for as long as this story has been told. Homer's own poem never states outright that the 2 men were lovers. In the physical sense, later Greek culture would have readily understood and accepted, describing them instead in the language of the closest possible companionship, and it is worth being honest that the oldest layer of this tradition leaves the question genuinely, deliberately open, rather than settling it either way. Later Greek writers, however, closer in time to Homer than we are, but still working within their own different assumptions about love between men, read the relationship quite differently, and it is worth pausing on how they read it, because it tells us something about how thoroughly this one friendship came to represent an ideal for the whole of later Greek culture. The playwright Aeschylus, in a now lost tragedy called the Myrmidons, staged the two men explicitly as lovers, and fragments of that same play, quoted by later ancient writers, show Achilles mourning Patroclus in language of physical intimacy the surviving Iliad itself never quite uses so plainly. The philosopher Plato, writing centuries later, has a character in his dialogue the Symposium discussed the two men at length as an example of a devoted, loving pair. Though that same character, in a detail worth noting, criticises Aeschylus for calling Achilles the older and more dominant of the two, arguing instead that Achilles, as the younger and more beautiful of the pair, must have been the beloved rather than the lover, by the particular conventions ancient Athenian audiences applied to relationships between men of different ages, a debate about the exact shape of their bond that later Greek audiences clearly found worth having in real detail. It is worth pausing too on what actually settles the question for this channel, not because any ancient source resolves it definitively, since none of them do, but because the poem's own account of Achilles' grief when Patroclus finally dies reads, on its own terms and regardless of any later gloss placed on top of it, as the grief of a man who has lost the single most important relationship of his entire life. A grief this whole story treats as larger and more consuming than anything else Achilles experiences from beginning to end, larger than his own wounded honour, larger, in the end, than his own fear of death, and it is worth carrying that ambiguity forward, deliberately unresolved, the way the oldest sources themselves leave it, rather than insisting on a single modern label for a bond. A poem composed nearly 3,000 years ago never felt the need to name so precisely in the first place. The Trojan assault, in the days following the embassy's failure, grew steadily more desperate for the Greeks, Hector himself at last breaching the wall around the ships and setting one of them alight, exactly the disaster that had been threatening the whole camp since Achilles' own withdrawal, and it was in this exact moment of crisis, with the entire expedition on the very edge of total ruin, that Patroclus came to Achilles' own tent, and it is worth pausing on the scene that follows, because the old poem gives it real and deliberate weight, showing us Patroclus in tears and Achilles seeing his own dearest companion weeping, comparing him, in a striking and tender simile, to a small girl running alongside her own mother, tugging at her dress and begging to be picked up, weeping until her mother finally relents, a comparison that tells us, in a single image, exactly how much affection lay underneath Achilles' own famously hard exterior. Patroclus begged Achilles for one thing, and it is worth being precise about exactly what he asked, because the precision matters enormously to what happens next. He didn't ask Achilles himself to rejoin the fighting, understanding that his friend's own anger at Agamemnon had not yet fully cooled, but asked instead that Achilles allow him to borrow his own famous armour, the armour every soldier on both sides of this war would instantly recognise, and lead the Myrmidon soldiers into battle in Achilles' own place, reasoning that the mere sight of that armour returning to the field, whoever actually wore it underneath, would be enough to terrify the Trojans and turn the battle's tide, buying the exhausted Greek army the breathing room it needed to save the burning ships. Achilles agreed, and it is worth pausing on the specific and careful condition he attached to that agreement, because the condition matters enormously to everything that happens next. He told Patroclus plainly to drive the Trojans back from the ships and then return immediately, under no circumstances pursuing the retreating enemy all the way back to the walls of Troy itself, a warning delivered. The old poem makes clear, out of real and specific fear, because Achilles understood that Patroclus, wearing his own armour and riding at the head of the Myrmidons, might be tempted, in the heat and the glory of a sudden reversal, to press the advantage further than was actually safe, and might, in doing so, come up against Hector himself, a confrontation Achilles feared his own beloved friend, brave and capable as he was, could not actually survive. Patroclus led the Myrmidon charge, and it is worth pausing on how completely, at first, the plan actually worked. the mere sight of Achilles' own distinctive armour returning to the field sending a genuine wave of terror through the Trojan lines, who believed, understandably, that the war's single most feared warrior had rejoined the fighting after all, and Patroclus, riding this wave of Trojan panic, drove the enemy back from the ships in a rout so total that it very nearly, in that single afternoon, undid every gain the Trojans had made across the entire preceding stretch of the war. And it was in the middle of that same triumphant rout that Patroclus faced and killed, in single combat, a Trojan ally named Sarpedon, a son of Zeus himself by a mortal woman. And it is worth pausing on this single death, because it produces one of the most quietly devastating images in the entire poem. Zeus, watching his own beloved mortal son about to die and unable, bound by the same cosmic rules that govern even the king of the gods himself, to actually intervene and save him, weeping instead tears of blood that fell as rain upon the battlefield below, a grief so total that even the ruler of all creation could do nothing to answer it. And it is worth holding that image alongside everything still ahead of us tonight, because it is going to matter in a very different form to Achilles' own grief before this night's story is finished. It is worth pausing too on what happened around Sarpedon's own body once he had fallen, because the fight over it very nearly matches in its own smaller way the fight that will one day break out over Patroclus' own corpse. Sarpedon's closest companion, a warrior named Glaucus, wounded himself and grieving, called out to Apollo for the strength to hold the field long enough to protect his friend's body from being stripped and dishonoured by the advancing Greeks, and Zeus, unable to save his own son's life, did what the deeper rules of this world still permitted him to do, sending Apollo down to lift Sarpedon's body gently from the battlefield, wash it clean of blood and dust in the waters of a nearby river, anoint it with ambrosia, and wrap it in garments that would never decay before handing it to the twin gods. Sleep and death themselves to carry swiftly home to Sarpedon's own grieving family in Lycia, so that a king denied the chance to save his own son's life could still, through the same god's mercy, spare that son the further indignity of dying unburied and unmourned on a foreign shore, a small act of tenderness worth holding in mind, because Hector, waiting only a little further down this same story, is not going to be granted anything like it. It was here, flush with this string of victories and the intoxicating rush of a battle finally turning decisively in his own favour, that Patroclus did exactly what Achilles had feared he might do, forgetting or simply ignoring in the heat of the moment his friend's own careful warning, and pressing the pursuit all the way to the very walls of Troy itself, where he was met at last by the god Apollo, who struck him from behind with such supernatural force that Patroclus' own helmet, Achilles' own famous helmet, was knocked from his head and sent rolling in the dust, his armour loosened and his own strength drained by the god's own hand, leaving him stunned and suddenly catastrophically vulnerable. And it was in that exact moment of divine-inflicted weakness that a Trojan soldier named Euphorbus struck him first with a spear, and Hector himself, arriving in the chaos and seeing his own enemy, already wounded and staggering, delivered the final fatal blow. It is worth pausing briefly on how completely this single sequence undercuts the ordinary simple logic of a hero's duel, because Patroclus, wearing the single most famous armour in this entire war, and fighting with real skill and real courage, was not, in the end, defeated by any mortal opponent's own superior swordsmanship at all, but stripped of his strength first by a god acting from a distance and without warning, and it is worth carrying that detail forward into everything still ahead of us tonight, because it means the whole cycle of vengeance that follows, Achilles killing Hector, and Paris and Apollo together killing Achilles in turn, is built at every single link in the chain on exactly this same uncomfortable foundation, a battlefield in which mortal skill and mortal courage matter enormously, and yet can be undone in a single unseen instant, by a god's own hand acting on motives the men actually dying never get to see or understand. It is worth pausing before we move any further on what Hector actually said to Patroclus as he lay dying, because the exchange matters to what happens between these two men before tonight's story is through. Hector, standing over his fallen enemy and believing, understandably, that he'd just killed Achilles himself, mocked the dying man, and Patroclus, with what little breath remained to him, corrected that mistaken belief with his own final words, telling Hector plainly that it was Apollo and Euphorbus who had truly killed him, that Hector himself had only delivered the final blow to a man already broken by a god's own hand, and warning him, in the very last words he ever spoke, that Hector's own death now stood close behind, delivered by Achilles' own hand, a prophecy Hector dismissed in the moment, but that would prove, before very much longer, to be entirely and devastatingly correct, a rage without any bottom, and a mother's grief that could not stop what was coming. Word of Patroclus' death reached Achilles by way of a messenger, and it is worth pausing on the scene that followed, because the old poem gives us one of the rawest and most physically vivid depictions of grief in the entire surviving corpus of ancient literature. Achilles collapsing to the ground, pouring dark ashes over his own head and his own fine tunic, tearing at his own hair with his own hands and lying there, stretched out in the dust, so lost in grief that the women of his own household feared, genuinely and immediately, that he might take his own life in that same instant, holding him and restraining him until the worst of that first unbearable wave had passed. His own cry of grief, the old poem tells us, was so loud and so terrible that it carried down through the water itself to his mother, far below the surface of the sea, and Thetis rose once more from the depths, exactly as she always did, to find her son in the very depths of a sorrow no earlier grief in this whole story had come close to matching, and it is worth pausing on what she already knew in that moment, because Thetis had long understood, from the very same prophecy that had first offered her son his two possible fates, that Achilles' own death was fated to come soon after Hector's, and she understood, watching him now, exactly what was coming next. Because there was no possible way this particular grief was going to end in anything other than Achilles seeking Hector out and killing him, whatever the cost. It is worth pausing here on the shape this grief actually took, because it did not resolve the way an ordinary sorrow might into mourning alone, but converted almost immediately into a rage so total and so consuming that it eclipsed, for the remainder of the story, every other consideration Achilles had ever weighed against it, including, remarkably, his own life. He told his mother plainly that he no longer cared whether he himself died at Troy, that he had, in effect, already made his peace with the fate he had chosen so long ago, so long as he was granted the chance to kill Hector first, and answer in blood for what had happened to Patroclus and Thetis, understanding that nothing she could say would turn her son from this path, did not try to argue him out of it at all, choosing instead, in the single most quietly loving act of this entire story, to help him accomplish it as completely as she possibly could, promising to bring him, by morning, a set of armour finer than any that had ever been forged for a mortal man, since his own famous armour, the very armour Patroclus had died wearing, had been stripped from his friend's body by the Trojans and was now, in a detail that would only deepen Achilles' own fury when he learned of it, being worn by Hector himself. Thetis went that same night to the forge of Hephaestus, the god of fire and craftsmanship, whose own workshop the old poem describes in loving extended detail, tended by golden handmaidens he had built himself, animated and given a kind of artificial intelligence to assist him in his own work, and Hephaestus, who owed Thetis a debt of gratitude from an old kindness she had shown him in his own troubled past, agreed immediately to forge Achilles a set of armour unlike anything any mortal warrior had ever worn, and it is worth pausing here, at real length, on the single object he actually made, because the shield Hephaestus forges for Achilles that night is, by the judgment of readers across nearly 3,000 years, one of the most extraordinary passages in the entire history of literature, and it is worth letting it breathe a little before we move on, because it is doing something this whole poem does nowhere else quite so completely. It is worth pausing briefly on the forge itself before we turn to what it produced, because the old poem takes real, unhurried pleasure in describing it, 20 bellows working at Hephaestus' own command, blowing every kind of blast a craftsman might need, some gentle and some fierce, entirely at their master's own spoken word. And it is worth pausing too on those golden handmaidens the god had built to assist him, because the poem is explicit that they were not simply decorative, but functional, given by their maker a mind of their own, and a voice and real strength, and taught by the gods themselves the skilled work their hands performed, an image of artificial constructed life so startling that it is worth remembering it comes to us not from any modern imagination at all, but from a poem approaching 3,000 years old, a Bronze Age audience already delighted by the idea of a craftsman clever enough to build his own living thinking helpers. Hephaestus, working through the night, covered the surface of that single shield with an entire miniature world, and it is worth walking through some of what he actually placed there, because the images he chose were not scenes of war at all, not primarily, but scenes of ordinary human life laid out in careful, deliberate contrast to the battlefield the shield itself was about to be carried into. He forged the earth and the sky and the sea, the sun and the moon, and the full-wheeling constellations of the night. He forged 2 cities, one at peace and one under siege, and in the city at peace he showed a wedding procession, moving through the streets with torches and music, and beside it, a dispute being argued out in the public square, 2 men contesting a payment owed for a killing, with the elders of the city sitting in judgment. A small, ordinary scene of a community working out its own justice through words rather than through spears. In the besieged city, by contrast, he showed an army camped outside the walls, and a desperate ambush being laid by night, war's own violence rendered in miniature bronze and gold and silver and tin, but even there, surrounded by fighting laid down between 2 scenes of ordinary peace, as though war itself were only ever one small, interrupting episode within a much larger and more enduring human life. And beyond the 2 cities, Hephaestus forged a whole calendar of ordinary human labour and joy, a field being ploughed, dark earth turning up behind the ploughman's own steps, though the shield itself was made of solid gold, a harvest being gathered in by reapers with a king standing by in silent satisfaction, a vineyard heavy with grapes being picked by laughing young men and women to the sound of a boy playing a lyre, a herd of cattle being driven out to pasture and attacked by lions, and a great dancing floor crowded with young men and young women dancing hand in hand. Exactly the way, the old poem tells us, a potter once made a dancing floor for a princess in a distant and half-remembered city. The whole scene ringed round by a great and shining river, the river ocean itself, at the very outermost edge of the shield, holding the entire world of the design safely within its own bounds. It is worth pausing on this shield, at real length, because it is doing something this whole story needs badly at exactly this moment, offering us, in the very object about to carry Achilles into the single most violent stretch of his entire life, a complete and deliberately peaceful vision of everything an ordinary human existence actually consists of. Weddings and lawsuits and harvests and dances and the ordinary, unglamorous business of simply living inside a community across the turning of an ordinary year, set directly against the narrow consuming rage that is about to drive the man carrying this same shield to do things that stand in the most total possible contrast to everything depicted on its own surface. It is worth returning to this image again before tonight's story is through, because it is the shield's own quiet argument, made in gold and silver and bronze rather than in words, that the whole world Achilles is about to turn his back on entirely in pursuit of Hector's death is in the end worth infinitely more than the single narrow act of vengeance he's about to give the whole of himself over to, an argument the poem never states outright but leaves resting, instead on the very shoulders of the man too consumed by grief and rage to look at it clearly in this particular moment. Immortal horses, and a voice no mortal was ever meant to hear. It is worth pausing before Achilles ever actually reaches the battlefield in his new armour, on one further scene from that same morning. because it is one of the strangest and most quietly devastating moments in this entire poem, and it involves neither a god nor a man at all. Among the many wedding gifts Peleus had received on that same glittering day on Mount Pelion that opened tonight's whole story were two immortal horses, Xanthos and Balios, a gift from the sea god Poseidon himself, swift-footed animals born in most tellings of the wind itself, and those same two horses had carried Achilles' own chariot faithfully through every battle of this long war, and had carried Patroclus too, wearing Achilles' own armour, on the very day that armour failed to protect the man wearing it. It is worth pausing on what happened when Achilles, grieving and furious, mounted that same chariot once more to ride out and avenge his friend, because the old poem tells us that the two horses, standing apart from the rest of the yoked team, wept, actual tears falling from their own immortal eyes into the dust at their own hooves, mourning Patroclus exactly as any grieving soldier might, and Achilles, seeing this, spoke to them directly, asking why they had let Patroclus die when they themselves, being immortal, could so easily have carried him to safety, and rebuking them gently not to abandon him in the same way when his own time came. And it is here that the poem allows something to happen that it allows nowhere else in its entire length. Because the goddess Hera, moved by what she had just witnessed, gave one of the two horses, Xanthos, a human voice for a single moment, and the horse spoke back to his own master, telling him plainly that this time, yes, they would carry him safely home from the battle still ahead, but that his own death was near regardless, decreed by a god and by an unbreakable fate, and that no swiftness of theirs, however great, could carry him past a doom that had already been settled. It is worth pausing on this single strange exchange, because it means that Achilles rides out to kill Hector, already having heard, for the second time in this whole story, and this time from the mouth of his own grieving horse, exactly what waits for him on the other side of that revenge, and it is worth noticing that he does not flinch from it, or turn back, or ask the horse to say anything further, answering only that he already knows he is fated to die far from his own father's home, and that he intends to press on regardless, because there is glory yet to be won in driving the Trojans to their fill of war before that particular fate finally arrives. The Erinyes, the ancient goddesses of vengeance and retribution, checked the horse's voice at that same moment, the poem tells us, silencing him before he could say anything more, as though even the gods themselves understood that a mortal man was never meant to hear his own death. Confirmed twice in a single morning by the very animal that was about to carry him toward it. A river fights back, and a whole battlefield chokes on the dead. Achilles, armed now in Hephaestus' own extraordinary work, was formally reconciled with Agamemnon the following morning, a reconciliation the poem handles with real economy, both men acknowledging, without much ceremony, that a god's own interference, an old madness sent by Zeus, had driven Agamemnon's original insult in the first place. A convenient explanation that let both men set the quarrel aside, without either fully backing down, and it is worth pausing on how little that reconciliation actually mattered to Achilles himself in this moment, a man who had, by this point, moved entirely past the original grievance over Briseis and honour and prizes of war into a rage that had nothing left to do with any of it, focused now on a single target and a single purpose that no formal reconciliation could touch at all. What followed was a single day of fighting unlike anything else in the entire poem, Achilles returning to the battlefield and cutting through the Trojan army with a fury the old poem struggles to find adequate comparison for, likening him at different moments to a raging fire sweeping through dry mountain forest, to a lion tearing through a helpless flock, to death itself walking among mortal men, and it is worth pausing on one single extraordinary episode from this same rampage, because it takes this whole story briefly into territory even stranger than anything we have covered so far tonight. Achilles drove so many terrified Trojan soldiers into the river Scamander, also called Xanthus, that ran near the city, and killed so many of them there, that the river itself, a god in its own right within this world's own logic, chocked on the sheer volume of the dead clogging its own waters, and rose up in genuine fury against the man responsible, its waters surging and crashing against Achilles directly, nearly drowning him in a battle between a single mortal man and an enraged river god that the poem narrates with real and vivid terror. Achilles fighting for his own life against a flood he could not simply outfight the way he outfought mortal soldiers, until Hephaestus himself, called in by the other gods to intervene, set the plain itself on fire, scorching the river's own banks and boiling its own waters until Scamander, finally overwhelmed by fire in a contest even a river god could not win, relented and let Achilles go. It is worth pausing briefly on the sheer scale of killing the poem describes in this single stretch of fighting, because it does not shy away from the specific ugly texture of what a genuinely unrestrained Achilles actually looked like on a battlefield, describing him taking 12 young Trojan men alive at the edge of that same river, not for ransom or for mercy, but explicitly as a human sacrifice, bound and led back to Patroclus' own funeral pyre days later to be killed there in his dead friend's honour. A detail this whole tradition does not soften or explain away, and one worth naming plainly, because it means the same man capable, within a matter of days, of weeping alongside the father of the very enemy he had just killed, was also capable, in the depths of his own grief, of a cruelty this story never asks us to fully forgive. It is worth pausing on this whole episode, strange as it is, because it marks the exact point at which Achilles' own rage has grown large enough to draw in the natural world itself. No longer a quarrel between men at all, but something closer to an environmental catastrophe. A single human being's grief and fury grown so total that even a river cannot simply stand by and let it pass unchallenged. And it is worth carrying that image with you as we move, at last, toward the confrontation. This whole day of slaughter has actually been building toward the meeting between Achilles and the one man he has been hunting since the moment his own grief first turned to rage. A wife at the wall and a child who cried at his own father's helmet. It is worth pausing before we follow Achilles into this final confrontation on a scene that actually belongs earlier in this same war, months before Patroclus' own death, because the poem itself pauses there too, and because nothing that follows tonight lands with its full weight, unless we understand exactly who Hector was to the people standing on the walls of Troy watching him go out to die. Earlier in that same year of fighting, in a lull between two separate waves of battle, Hector had returned briefly inside the city to urge the Trojan women toward prayer, and his own wife Andromache, the woman whose entire birth family, as we heard a little while ago tonight, Achilles had already destroyed in a raid years before this scene even takes place, came to meet him at the city's great gate, carrying their infant son in the arms of a nurse walking beside her. It is worth pausing on what Andromache actually said to her husband in that scene, because the old poem gives her a speech of real and considered weight, telling Hector plainly that he is, to her, not only a husband but her own father and mother and brother as well, since Achilles has taken all three from her already, and begging him, with a specificity that makes the plea genuinely painful to sit with, not to make their own son an orphan and herself a widow by returning to a fight she is certain, with something close to prophetic clarity, is going to kill him. Hector, in his own answer, does not deny what she fears, and it is worth pausing on how openly he admits it, telling her that he knows, in his own heart, that the day is coming when sacred Troy will fall, and Priam's whole people with it. A grief, he says, troubles him less, in this moment, than the thought of Andromache herself being led away afterward as a captive to some foreign land, weaving another woman's cloth and carrying another woman's water, her own former life as a Trojan queen's daughter-in-law reduced entirely to the plunder economy that this whole night's story has already shown us, claimed Briseis and Chryseis and so many other women besides. And then, in the single most tender and most often remembered moment of this entire scene, Hector reaches for his own infant son, and the boy, named Astyanax, lord of the city, by the people of Troy in honour of his own father's fame, bursts into frightened tears at the sight of him, terrified not by his own father's face at all, but by the tall, crested bronze helmet on his father's head, its horsehair plume nodding fearfully above him, and Hector, laughing gently despite everything he has just said, removes the helmet and sets it on the ground, and takes his own son into his arms, and prays aloud in front of both his wife and the assembled elders of the city, that this same small boy might grow to be an even greater warrior than his own father, remembered by his own people as a man who brings home the bloody spoils of a defeated enemy. A prayer that lands to any listener who already knows how the rest of this story ends, with a particular and unbearable irony, because that same infant son, once Troy itself finally falls in the war's last night, will be thrown from the very walls his mother is standing on in this scene, killed by the same Greek army now camped on the beach below, precisely so that he can never grow up to avenge a father. This same army was, at the moment of this tender scene, still only weeks away from killing. It is worth carrying this whole scene with you now, as we move at last toward the confrontation between Achilles and Hector, that this entire night has been building toward, because it means that the man Achilles is about to kill is not simply Troy's greatest warrior, an obstacle standing between one grieving Greek soldier and his own revenge, but a husband who removed his own helmet to keep from frightening his infant son, a man who already knew, with a clarity most of us are mercifully spared, exactly how his own story and his own city's story were going to end, and who walked out to face that ending anyway, because a whole city full of people who had no one else left to defend them were standing on the walls behind him, watching. 3 times around the walls, and a goddess's cruel trick, Hector, watching the devastation Achilles was inflicting on the Trojan army from the walls of his own city, made the decision, against the pleading of both his own father Priam and his own mother Hecuba, both of whom begged him from the walls not to face Achilles alone, to remain outside the gates and meet his enemy in single combat, a decision the poem allows him real and considered dignity in making. A man who understood by this point, with something close to full clarity, exactly what fate he was walking toward, but who could not, in the end, bring himself to retreat behind his own city's walls, while his own people still needed a defender standing between them and the wrath now bearing down on the entire city. It is worth pausing before the actual duel on what happened when Achilles himself finally came into view, because Hector's own courage, held so firmly through the pleading of both his parents, wavered badly in that first sight of his approaching enemy, and he turned and ran. And it is worth being honest about that moment rather than smoothing it over, because the poem does not smooth it over either, showing us the single greatest defender Troy possessed, fleeing in genuine terror before the man he had moments earlier resolved to face. Achilles pursued him 3 full times around the entire circuit of the walls of Troy, a chase the old poem stages with the whole city, and even the assembled gods on Olympus watching in silence. And it is worth pausing on one small, devastating detail buried inside that chase, because the poem tells us the 2 men ran, in that desperate circuit, directly past the very spring and washing troughs, where, in peacetime, the women of Troy had once washed their own bright clothing before the coming of the Greeks, a single image of ordinary domestic life glimpsed in passing, during the middle of a chase that both men understood, by this point, could only end in one of their deaths. It was Zeus himself, weighing the 2 men's fates on a golden scale in a scene the poem stages with real and deliberate solemnity, who found Hector's own fate sinking down toward death, and it was Athena, acting now on that settled judgment, who descended to the battlefield and, in a piece of divine trickery this whole tradition allows without much apparent discomfort, disguised herself as Hector's own brother Deiphobus, appearing at his side and persuading him, with false and encouraging words, to stop his own flight and stand his ground against Achilles at last, promising to fight alongside him, a promise that gave Hector, believing he finally had an ally at his side, the courage to turn and face his pursuer, only for the disguised goddess to vanish the moment the actual fighting began, leaving Hector to discover, in the middle of the single most consequential combat of his own life, that he was standing entirely alone. The duel itself, once it finally began, did not last long, And it is worth pausing on how the poem handles its ending, because even here, at the climax of this whole rage-driven pursuit, it allows Hector a final moment of real and considered dignity. Struck in the end by a single spear thrust through a small gap in his own armour at the throat, Hector, dying, begged Achilles for one thing only, that his own body be returned to his family for proper burial rather than left for the dogs and birds to defile, an appeal to the most basic and universal decency this whole war had, up to this point, still generally observed, and Achilles refused him, telling his dying enemy, with a coldness that measures exactly how far his own grief had carried him from any ordinary human restraint, that no prayers or ransom could move him, that he wished he had it in himself to cut Hector's own flesh apart and eat it raw for what had been done to Patroclus, and Hector, with his very last breath, prophesied, exactly as Patroclus himself had prophesied to him in his own final moments, that Achilles' own death stood close behind, delivered before the gates of Troy by Paris and Apollo together, a prophecy Achilles received in this moment with something close to indifference, telling his dying enemy that he would meet whatever death the gods had planned for him whenever it came. It is worth pausing, at real length, on what Achilles did next, because it is the single ugliest act attributed to him anywhere in this entire tradition, and it is worth naming it plainly rather than softening it, because this whole channel has always tried to hold its heroes to an honest account of both their glory and their cruelty together. Achilles stripped Hector's body of its armour, and then, in an act of deliberate and prolonged desecration that shocked even some of the watching gods, pierced the tendons of both of Hector's own feet, threaded a cord through them, and tied the body to the back of his own chariot, dragging it face down through the dust, all the way back to the Greek camp, and continuing over the following days to drag the same corpse in humiliating circles around Patroclus' own funeral mound, again and again, in a grief that had curdled entirely into something closer to obsession, unmoved even when the gods themselves, watching from Olympus, began to protest that this kind of treatment shamed Achilles far more than it answered anything Hector himself had actually done. It is worth pausing before we move on to how the Greeks themselves chose to spend the days that followed, on how the city of Troy itself received the news of Hector's death, because the poem allows the losing side of this war a grief every bit as fully realised as anything it grants the men who won. Hecuba, seeing her son's body dragged past the walls behind Achilles' own chariot, cried out and tore at her own hair. Priam had to be physically restrained by his own household from rushing out through the gates unarmed to beg for his son's body on the spot, days before the ransom journey we are going to follow later tonight was even possible. And Andromache, the poem tells us, had not yet even heard the news when it happened, working quietly at her own loom inside the palace and ordering a hot bath prepared for her husband's return from battle, exactly the way any wife waiting for any soldier might, until the sound of wailing from the walls reached her own ears, and she ran, dropping the shuttle from her own hands to see for herself, and fainted at the sight of Hector's body being dragged through the dust before the very city he had just died defending. It is worth pausing too on the three laments spoken over Hector's own body once it was finally returned to Troy, because the poem gives each of the three women who deliver them a genuinely distinct grief, rather than a single, interchangeable sorrow. Andromache speaks first, mourning not only her husband but the son they leave behind, orphaned in a city she already knows, with the same clarity she showed at the wall months earlier, cannot possibly survive its own coming fall, a grief already reaching forward into a future she cannot prevent. Hecuba speaks next, grieving the son she calls the dearest of all her many children to the gods themselves, and finding a small, strange comfort in the fact that his body, unlike so many other war dead left to rot on the battlefield, has at least been brought home whole to be properly mourned. And Helen speaks last, and it is worth pausing on her words longer than the other two, because Helen, the one woman in this entire story, whose very presence in Troy the whole war was fought over, tells the gathered mourners that Hector was the only person in the entire city who never once spoke a harsh word to her in all the years of her own difficult exile there, defending her even against his own brothers and his own mother's occasional reproach, and that with Hector gone she has lost the last friend she had left, in a city that had never fully forgiven her for the war. Her own presence there was blamed for starting, a grief that reminds us, one final time before this whole story turns toward its own ending, that the woman whose face is supposed to have launched an entire war spent that same war as isolated and as friendless, within the very walls she was fought over, as almost anyone else this whole tradition ever shows us. Games on the beach and a debt of gratitude paid to a fallen friend. Before we follow Achilles' own grief to its final and most human resolution, it is worth pausing on how this whole army chose to honour Patroclus in the days immediately following Hector's death, because the funeral games held in his memory occupy a real and substantial stretch of the poem's own final chapters, and it is worth pausing on them briefly, because they offer this whole story one last welcome breath of ordinary, almost cheerful competition before its final and heaviest chapter arrives. Achilles himself presided over the games, offering rich prizes, tripods and cauldrons and fine horses and captive women and bars of gold and iron for a whole series of contests, a chariot race that the old poem narrates with real excitement and a good deal of comic squabbling among the competing drivers, boxing and wrestling matches, a foot race, a spear-throwing contest, and an archery competition. And it is worth pausing on this whole sequence, because it shows us, in the middle of the single most sorrowful stretch of this entire story, an army still capable of ordinary joy and ordinary rivalry and ordinary laughter, ash still fresh on their own commander's grief, and yet fully present too, for the simple pleasure of watching two men wrestle to a good-natured draw. It is worth pausing on a few of these contests individually, because the poem lingers on them with a warmth and a humour it rarely allows itself elsewhere in this whole grief-heavy story. The chariot race very nearly ended in a fistfight of its own, when the younger driver Antilochus, Nestor's own son, used a clever and faintly reckless piece of driving to overtake the older and more experienced Menelaus on a narrow stretch of the course, and Menelaus, furious at what he considered an unsafe manoeuvre, nearly challenged him afterward before Antilochus, with a grace that impressed the whole watching army, simply apologised and offered to hand over his own prize rather than let the disagreement fester, a small human moment of sportsmanship. This whole poem is glad to make room for even here, in the shadow of so much death. The wrestling match between Ajax and Odysseus, the same two men who will, before this night's story is finished, find themselves locked in a far more bitter contest over Achilles' own armour, ended in a good-natured draw that Achilles himself called, before either man could be seriously hurt, unwilling, even in his own continuing grief, to see two of his own most valued comrades injured over a prize that mattered far less than either of their own lives. And in the foot race, Athena herself intervened on Odysseus' behalf, causing the favoured runner, Ajax the Lesser, a different and lesser-known Ajax from the larger hero of the same name, to slip and fall face first into a pile of dung left behind by the sacrificial cattle at the very moment he seemed certain to win, a moment of real, unfiltered comedy that the whole watching army, the poem tells us, laughed at freely. And it is worth pausing on that laughter for a moment, because it means this whole army, exhausted by 9 years of siege and freshly grieving its own two greatest losses, could still, when the moment allowed it, laugh together at something as simple and as ordinary as a man falling into manure, a small, human mercy tucked into the middle of one of the saddest stretches of the entire poem. It's worth pausing, too, on how gently and how fairly Achilles himself conducted these games, a striking contrast to the man who had just spent days dragging his own enemy's corpse in humiliating circles, resolving disputes among the competing warriors with real patience, offering extra prizes to soothe hurt feelings, and even setting aside, unclaimed, a prize for an elderly hero named Nestor, too old himself to compete but honoured nonetheless for his own long years of service to the whole expedition. And it is worth carrying that gentleness with you into everything still ahead of us tonight, because it is a reminder that the same man capable of the raw, uncontrolled fury we have followed across this entire evening's story remained capable too of real tenderness and real fairness, especially toward the men who had fought and suffered alongside him for so many years. A both and complexity this whole tradition never lets us forget, however far his own rage carries him in the moments when it takes hold. An old king walks alone across a battlefield at night. It is here at last that we arrive back at the scene we opened tonight's whole story with, because Achilles, even after the funeral games had ended, continued dragging Hector's own body around Patroclus's tomb, day after day, a desecration the gods on Olympus at last agreed, nearly unanimously had gone on long enough, protected from decay only by Apollo's own continuing intervention, and Zeus himself finally decided that the situation could not be allowed to continue, sending the goddess Iris down to Priam himself, in his own grief-stricken palace in Troy, with a message and a plan that the old king should gather a rich ransom, travel alone except for a single herald under cover of night, directly into the heart of the Greek camp, and beg Achilles in person for the return of his own son's body. It is worth pausing on how much courage that instruction actually demanded of an old man, who had by this point lost so many of his own sons to the very army he was now being asked to walk alone into the middle of. And the old poem gives Priam's own preparation real and careful weight, showing him gathering an extraordinary ransom, fine robes and gold and bronze tripods and cups, and setting out that same night with only his aged herald Idaeus for company, guided, in a detail worth pausing on, by the god Hermes himself, sent by Zeus to guide the old king safely through the Greek camp's own sentries and directly to Achilles' own tent, appearing to Priam disguised as a young Greek soldier, and leading him, unseen and unchallenged, straight to his destination. It is worth pausing too on how hard his own household fought to stop him from going at all, because Hecuba, his wife and queen, and the mother of most of the sons this same war had already cost her, begged him not to go, calling the whole plan a kind of madness, pleading with him to stay safely behind his own walls and mourn Hector from a distance rather than walking, alone and unarmed, into the tent of the very man responsible for so much of her own grief, a man she describes in words the old poem gives her without softening, as wild and untrustworthy, a man who would show an old king no more mercy than he had shown her own son. Priam did not deny the danger. He told her plainly that if some god had decreed this was how he was meant to die, in Achilles' own tent, then he accepted that death gladly so long as he could hold his own son's body in his arms one final time first. A willingness to trade his own life for one last certainty that tells us, better than almost anything else in this entire story, exactly how total a father's grief can become. It is worth pausing too on the encounter with Hermes along the way, because the god did not simply guide Priam silently through the camp, but spoke with him at length, disguised as a young Myrmidon soldier, asking the old king gently why he travelled so late at night through territory this dangerous, and Priam, not recognising the god beneath the disguise, answered honestly. And it is worth noticing that Hermes, hearing the old king's grief laid out plainly, was moved by it, and chose, on his own initiative and beyond whatever Zeus had originally instructed him to do, to walk beside Priam the whole rest of the way himself, past every sentry, putting each guard to sleep with a touch of his own golden wand, so that Priam's own passage through an entire hostile army went entirely unseen. A small and genuinely tender act of mercy from a god who had no particular obligation to offer Priam anything beyond the bare instructions he had already been given, and it is worth carrying that small kindness with you, now, because it means that even in the depths of this whole war's own cruelty, this particular story keeps finding small pockets of unexpected gentleness, offered by gods and men alike, in exactly the moments this whole tradition most needs them. Priam entered Achilles' tent, and it is worth pausing on the scene that follows for as long as it deserves, because it is, by the judgment of readers across nearly 3,000 years, the single most moving passage in the entire poem, and perhaps in the whole of ancient literature. The old king knelt before the young warrior who had killed so many of his own children, and in the gesture we open tonight's whole story with, took Achilles' own hands, the hands that had killed Hector and so many of Priam's other sons besides, and kissed them, and asked Achilles to remember his own father Peleus, an old man himself now, far away in Phthia, and to imagine what it would mean to that same father to lose a son the way Priam had just lost his, and to imagine further what it would mean to be an old man surrounded by enemies, as Priam himself now was, forced to do what no king had ever been asked to do before, kneeling in front of the very man who had killed his own child, and kissing the hands that had done it, simply for the chance to bring that child's body home for a proper burial. It is worth pausing at real length on what happened inside Achilles in that single moment, because the poem shows us something it has not shown us anywhere else across this entire long story. A rage that had consumed nearly everything else in him for days finally breaking, not into more anger, but into grief shared openly with the very man he had every reason, by the war's own logic, to hate. Achilles wept, the poem tells us, for his own father, whom he would never see again, and for Patroclus, whose death had started this whole final chapter of fury, and Priam, kneeling in front of him, wept for Hector, and the two men, an old Trojan king and the young Greek warrior who had killed his son, sat together in that tent and grieved openly in each other's presence, two enemies bound in that single unguarded moment, not by the war that had brought them together, but by the simple, universal fact of loss itself, a grief that did not care, in that moment, which side of the battlefield either man had been fighting on. It is worth pausing, too, on one further piece of this same exchange, because Achilles, once his own tears had passed, offered Priam a single, extraordinary reflection that stands among the most philosophically striking passages in the entire poem, telling the old king that Zeus keeps two great urns standing at the threshold of his own hall, one filled with evils and one with blessings, and that every mortal life is measured out from some mixture of the two. A man granted a portion of both sorrow and joy, living a life of ordinary mingled fortune, while a man granted only evils from that second, crueler urn walks the whole earth despised and hunted by misery with no relief at all, and Achilles tells Priam plainly that his own father Peleus was, by this same accounting, given a portion of blessing beyond nearly any other mortal, wealth and a goddess for a wife and a son beyond compare, but that this same fortunate man had been given, mixed into that same portion, no lasting joy in his own son at all, since that son was fated to die young, far from home, and would never again see his aging father's face. It is worth pausing on the fact that Achilles offers this reflection not to excuse Priam's own suffering, but to place it inside a larger shared human condition. A warrior who has spent this entire story chasing an undying name, now speaking, in his own gentlest and most reflective moment, not of glory at all, but of the plain, universal, unavoidable mixture of sorrow and blessing that every single mortal life, his own included, is finally measured out from. Achilles, moved at last past his own rage, agreed to return Hector's body, and it is worth pausing on the small human details the poem gives us of what followed, because they matter enormously to how this whole scene lands. He had his own attendants wash and anoint Hector's body himself, out of Priam's sight, so the old king would not have to watch the body of his own son, still bearing the marks of days of desecration, being tended to. He offered Priam food and a place to sleep, insisting, with a gentleness the rest of this story has rarely shown us, that grief, however total, still requires a person to eat and to rest, exactly the advice the poem notes that the goddess Niobe herself had once needed after losing all of her own children in a single day, a story we may well tell in full on Another Night in This Room. And he granted Priam a formal truce, 11 full days, so that Troy could properly mourn and bury its own greatest defender without fear of Greek attack. A mercy that meant Achilles, the man who had dragged Hector's corpse through the dust for days on end, ended that same story by giving his enemy's family exactly the time and the peace they needed to grieve him properly. It is worth pausing before we move past this scene on what it actually tells us about the whole shape of this story, because the Iliad itself, remarkably, chooses to end not with a Greek triumph, not with the fall of Troy, not even with Achilles' own death, but with Hector's funeral, an old king walking home from his own enemy's tent with his son's body, and a whole city gathering to mourn him, and it is worth sitting with that choice for a long moment, because it means this entire epic, built around one man's rage from its very first word, chooses to close instead on an act of shared grief and shared mercy between two enemies, as though the poem itself, having spent so many thousands of lines showing us exactly what unrestrained fury costs, wanted to leave us in its final pages with a quieter and more difficult truth, that even the deepest rage this tradition ever imagined could, in the end, be moved by an old man's grief into something close to tenderness. Beyond the last page of the old poem, an Amazon queen and a shadow from the south. It is worth pausing here, because the Iliad itself, the oldest and most authoritative source for nearly everything we have told you tonight, actually ends with Hector's funeral, and everything still ahead of us in tonight's story, Achilles' own death among it, comes down to us not from Homer's own hand at all, but from a wider constellation of poems, now mostly lost except in fragments and later summaries, that ancient audiences knew collectively as the epic cycle. Works with titles like the Ethiopies, composed to fill in the stretches of this whole war that the Iliad and the Odyssey, its companion poem, leave untold, and it is worth being honest with you about that shift in our sources now, because the episodes still ahead of us tonight come to us in a far more fragmentary and far less certain form than everything we have covered so far, pieced together from summaries written centuries after the original poems themselves were lost, from vase paintings, and from later authors who retold these same stories in their own words long after the oldest versions had already vanished. The first of these episodes brings a new and formidable enemy to the battlefield outside Troy, an Amazon queen named Penthesilea, leading a contingent of her own warrior women to Troy's aid in the war's final weeks, and it's worth pausing on this episode, because it gives this whole story one of its strangest and most emotionally complicated moments. Penthesilea fought with real skill and real ferocity, and Achilles, meeting her at last in single combat, killed her, exactly as he had killed every other formidable opponent this whole war had put in front of him, and it was only in the instant of her death, as her helmet fell away and her face was revealed to him for the first time, that Achilles, by the account several later sources give us, fell suddenly and overwhelmingly in love with the woman he had just killed, a grief and a longing so immediate and so total that it is worth pausing on what it tells us about this man's own capacity for feeling, a warrior whose rage had, by this point in the war, cost so many lives, discovering, in the very moment of one more killing, an entirely different and entirely unexpected emotion rising up to answer it, love arriving in this single strange episode, exactly one moment too late to matter to the woman it was actually meant for. It is worth pausing too on who Penthesilea actually was before that single afternoon, because several later sources give her own arrival at Troy a motive worth sitting with. She had, in some tellings, killed her own sister, Hippolyte, by accident, in a hunting mishap or a moment of confused battle, and had come to Troy seeking not merely to aid an allied city, but a warrior's death that might count, within her own people's own harsh moral accounting as a kind of purification for that accidental killing. a woman who rode into the single most dangerous war of the age already carrying a private grief of her own, hoping to answer it with a glorious death rather than a long life spent under its weight. An echo, worth noticing quietly, of the very choice Achilles himself had made so many years before her. The battle between them, when it finally came, is described by later sources as genuinely fierce for as long as it lasted, Penthesilea matching Achilles blow for blow in a way very few of his other opponents in this whole war ever managed, before his own overwhelming strength finally told, and it is worth holding her alongside Sarpedon and Memnon as we move now toward the final stretch of tonight's story, one more formidable warrior, brought to Troy by loyalty or grief, or the simple hope of a meaningful death, who found all three of those things waiting for her at the end of Achilles' own spear. It's worth pausing too on the ugly coda several later sources attached to this same episode, because a Greek soldier named Thersites, a notoriously crude and disrespectful figure who appears elsewhere in this tradition mocking Agamemnon's own leadership in front of the whole assembled army, is said to have mocked Achilles publicly for grieving over a dead enemy, and possibly to have desecrated Penthesilea's own body in some further insult. And Achilles, in a fury this tradition treats with considerably less sympathy than his earlier rage against Hector, killed him on the spot, an act that even his own allies found troubling enough that Achilles was compelled to travel elsewhere for ritual purification before he could properly rejoin the fighting. One more reminder that this man's temper, even in the war's final weeks, had not cooled nearly as much as his tears over Priam might have suggested. A second great ally arrived soon after to aid the beleaguered Trojans, Memnon, king of the Ethiopians, another figure with divine blood of his own, the son of the dawn goddess Eos, leading his own formidable contingent to Troy's defence. And it is worth pausing on the confrontation between Memnon and Achilles, because the later sources give it a weight and a symmetry that mirrors, quite deliberately, the earlier death of Sarpedon we discussed a while ago tonight. Another son of a god fighting and dying far from his own home, another divine parent forced to watch, powerless to change what the deeper rules of fate had already decided. Zeus himself, in the accounts several later authors preserve, weighed the fates of both warriors on his own golden scales, exactly as he had once weighed Hector's fate against Achilles' own, and found Memnon's own life sinking down toward death, and Achilles killed him, and Eos, his own grieving mother, is said to have wept tears at his death that fall to this day as morning dew, a small, tender, cosmic detail that this whole tradition offers as its own quiet way of saying that even the losing side of this endless war produced grief every bit as real and every bit as total as anything felt on the Greek side of the battlefield. It is worth pausing, briefly, on that same goddess Eos, because listeners who have followed this story closely tonight will already recognise her by another name entirely, since it is Eos, the rosy-fingered dawn, whose own arrival the old poem announces again and again across its own many thousands of lines, waking mortal men to yet another day of fighting, beneath the sky she herself coloured on her way up from the eastern horizon. And it is worth sitting for a moment with the strange intimacy of that realisation, that the same gentle, recurring image this whole poem uses simply to mark the passing of ordinary time, one more sunrise, one more day of siege, belonged the entire time to a goddess who would eventually watch this same war take her own son from her, exactly as it had already taken Sarpedon from Zeus, and would soon enough take Achilles himself from Thetis. Every dawn that ever broke over that beach carrying, unknowingly, the memory of its own goddess's own grief, still to come. An arrow at the gates, and the fulfilment of an old prophecy. It is here at last that this whole story arrives, at the death both Patroclus and Hector had separately, and with their very last breaths, prophesied for the man who had killed them both. And it is worth pausing on exactly how that death is said to have come, because the later sources, fragmentary as they are, generally agree on its essential shape even where they differ on its smaller details. Achilles, pressing his own advantage in the fighting outside the walls, was struck near the Scaean gates of Troy by an arrow fired by Paris, the same Trojan prince whose own theft of Helen had started this entire war, a man the whole of this tradition otherwise treats with something close to contempt. A soft, unheroic figure far better suited, in nearly every earlier scene he appears in, to the bedroom than the battlefield. And it is worth pausing on the irony of that pairing, because it meant that the single greatest warrior the Greek world ever imagined, a man who had killed Hector, Troy's own greatest defender, in fair and evenly matched combat, was killed in the end, not by any warrior of comparable skill at all, but by the one man in this entire story least suited to have delivered a killing blow. And it is worth naming plainly too, what every version of this story insists made that killing blow possible in the first place, that Apollo himself, the same god who had already intervened so often and so decisively across this whole war, guided the arrow's own flight, because an ordinary man's aim, however lucky, could never on its own have brought down a warrior this formidable. It is here that the later tradition, the one that gave us the Styx-dipping story we discussed at real length earlier tonight, tells us the arrow struck Achilles' own heel, the single unguarded point in an otherwise invulnerable body. Though it is worth remembering one final time that this specific detail belongs to Statius, and to the later Roman retellings of this story rather than to the oldest layers of the tradition, which speak more simply of Achilles being struck down by Paris and Apollo together without specifying any particular vulnerable point at all, since Homer's own Achilles, as we discussed near the start of tonight's story, was never invulnerable to begin with. Whichever version you find more moving, and this channel does not think there is anything wrong with holding on to the heel, because it has become, across the centuries since, a genuinely useful and genuinely beautiful way of talking about the single, unguarded place inside even the strongest among us. It is worth pausing on the plain, historical honesty of admitting that the two versions come from different centuries and different poets, layered one on top of the other. The way this whole tradition so often layers newer stories over older ones, each generation of tellers adding something the last generation had not yet imagined. It is worth pausing too on the battle that broke out over Achilles' own body once he had fallen, because this whole tradition, consistent in this, if in little else, insists that even in death this particular man's body was worth fighting over. The Trojans pressing forward to claim it as a trophy, and the Greeks fighting with everything they had left to prevent it. And it was Ajax, the same blunt, loyal warrior who had once appealed to Achilles' own sense of comradeship during the failed embassy, who carried the body itself back to the Greek camp on his own shoulders, while Odysseus, fighting a desperate rearguard action at his side, held off the pursuing Trojans long enough for that rescue to succeed. A partnership between two men who would, before very much longer, find themselves bitter rivals rather than allies, in a story we are about to tell. A funeral pyre lit twice, and a quarrel over armour that ends in madness. Achilles' own funeral, when it finally came, was staged by the grieving Greek army with a splendour that matched, in every particular, the honour he had earned across 9 years of war. His body burned on a pyre alongside offerings of honey and oil. His own armour and treasured possessions burned or buried with him. And, in a detail this whole tradition finds genuinely moving, his ashes gathered afterward and mixed together with the ashes of Patroclus, the two men who had been inseparable in life, buried together, at last, in a single shared tomb on the shore near Troy. A resting place the old sources tell us the whole Greek army raised into a great visible mound meant to be seen and remembered by every sailor who ever passed that particular stretch of coastline for as long as ships continued to sail that same sea. Thetis herself, along with her own divine sisters, the other Nereids, rose from the sea to mourn her son, and the 9 muses themselves are said to have sung a lament over his body, and funeral games were held once more, exactly as they had once been held for Patroclus, a whole army pausing its own war one final time to properly honour the single greatest warrior it had ever fielded. It is worth pausing before we move on to what became of his armour. On a separate and considerably stranger tradition, several ancient sources preserve, alongside the more straightforward account of Achilles' own funeral, because it offers this whole story one final unexpected variation on the two fates choice we have carried with us since the very beginning of tonight's telling. Several poets and later mythographers, drawing on the same lost Ethiopis that gave us Penthesilea and Memnon, tell us that Thetis, unable to bear watching her son's body simply burn to ash on an ordinary pyre, snatched him from the flames at the very last possible moment and carried him instead to a distant, half-mythical island at the edge of the known world called Leucae, the White Island, where he was granted a strange kind of afterlife, neither fully the undying glory of Olympus, nor the grey, diminished existence of an ordinary shade in the underworld, but something in between, said by some tellings to spend his days there in the company of other great heroes, and, in one particularly striking variant, married in that same afterlife to Helen herself, the very woman whose abduction had started the whole war that killed him. 2 figures whose names had been bound together by a decade of bloodshed neither of them had actually chosen, given, in this one late and unusual telling, a strange kind of peace together at the very end of it all. It is worth pausing on why this variant tradition mattered enough to later audiences that it kept getting retold alongside the more common account of a simple funeral and a shared tomb, because it suggests that some part of this whole tradition was never quite comfortable letting Achilles' own 2 fates bargain resolve as cleanly as the main story insists it must. A short life traded cleanly for undying fame, full stop, no further negotiation. The Luke tradition offers, instead, something closer to a third option nobody ever actually promised him. A small, quiet afterlife alongside the very people this whole war had cost him the most to be near, and it is worth carrying that alternate ending with you now. Not because this channel believes it is any more historically real than the golden apple or the immortal talking horse, but because it tells us something true about how badly, across nearly 3,000 years of retelling, audience after audience has wanted this particular story to end somewhere gentler than a burning pyre on a foreign shore. It was among the prizes offered at these same funeral games that the next chapter of this story took its shape, because Achilles' own famous armour, forged by Hephaestus himself and carrying, by this point, the accumulated weight of everything it had already seen, Patroclus' death and Hector's death, and now Achilles' own, needed a new owner, and 2 men, and only 2 men, were considered worthy candidates for it by the whole assembled army. Ajax, the single largest and physically strongest warrior left among the Greeks, and Odysseus, the cleverest, whose skill with words and strategy had contributed as much to the war's actual conduct as any single warrior's own strength in battle. It is worth pausing on this contest, because it is, in its own way, a final echo of the exact tension this whole story has been circling since its very opening scene, an argument over what actually constitutes a warrior's true worth, brute strength and battlefield courage on one side, cunning and strategy and persuasive speech on the other, and the assembled Greeks, or in some versions Trojan prisoners asked to judge the contest with an outsider's supposedly impartial eye, awarded the armour to Odysseus, a decision that devastated Ajax so completely, believing his own years of loyal, unglamorous battlefield service had just been publicly judged worth less than clever speeches, that he descended, in the tragedy the Athenian playwright Sophocles built around this exact episode, into a fit of madness in which he slaughtered a flock of the army's own livestock, believing in his own disordered mind that he was killing Agamemnon and Odysseus, and the other men he held responsible for his humiliation, and waking afterward to discover what he'd actually done, and unable to bear the shame of it, took his own life on his own sword rather than live any longer inside a humiliation that large. It is worth pausing on Ajax's own death for a moment, because it belongs, in its own quiet way, alongside everything else this story has shown us tonight about the exact cost of the honour culture this whole war was built around. A man who had fought loyally and bravely for 9 full years, who had personally carried Achilles' own body back from the battlefield, undone in the end not by any Trojan spear, but by the simple, unbearable judgment that his own contribution had been valued less than a rival's. One more casualty this war claimed from inside its own camp, rather than from across the battlefield, and it is worth carrying his death with you, alongside Patroclus's and Achilles' own, as we move now toward the final, darkest coda this whole story still has left to tell. A tomb that demanded one more sacrifice. It is worth pausing before we let Achilles' own story finally come to rest on one last episode several later sources attached to his memory, because it is genuinely difficult to hear, and this whole channel has always tried to be honest with you about the parts of these old stories that do not offer any comfortable resolution. Once Troy itself finally fell, taken at last through the trick of the wooden horse we told in full detail on another night in this room, several ancient sources tell us that the ghost of Achilles appeared to the victorious Greek army and demanded, before the fleet could safely sail home, that a young Trojan princess named Polyxena, a daughter of Priam whom several versions of this tradition claim Achilles had loved, or at least desired, in the final weeks of his own life, be sacrificed at his own tomb, exactly the way Iphigenia had once nearly been sacrificed at Aulis to secure this whole war's beginning, a demand the Greek army, exhausted and eager to finally sail home, ultimately honoured, and it was Achilles' own son, Neoptolemus, the boy born on Skyros to Deidamia, who had never properly known his own father, summoned to Troy in the war's final year specifically because a prophecy declared the city could not fall without him, who is said, in the tragedy Euripides built around this same episode, to have delivered the killing blow himself. It is worth pausing too on the small, bitter footnotes several later sources attached to Paris's own end, because we promised, earlier tonight, to return to the nymph he abandoned for Helen's sake, and it is worth honouring that promise now. Paris himself did not survive the war much longer than Achilles did, killed, in most tellings, by a poisoned arrow fired by a Greek archer named Philoctetes, who wielded, in a detail this whole tradition is fond of, the very bow that had once belonged to Heracles himself, a weapon we heard about at length on another night in this room. Dying and in agony, Paris is said to have sent for Oenone, the nymph whose gift for healing might genuinely have saved him, and Oenone, remembering exactly how completely he had abandoned her for Helen's sake all those years before, refused to come, and Paris died of the wound before she could change her mind. And when word reached her afterward of what her own refusal had cost, several later sources tell us, her grief overwhelmed whatever bitterness had driven that refusal in the first place, and she took her own life rather than go on living with it. One final small tragedy folded into a war that this whole story keeps insisting, again and again, cost far more than the single golden apple that started it could ever have been worth. It is worth pausing on this whole episode because it closes this story with a symmetry that is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. A war that began with one young woman's sacrifice at Aulis, demanded so that the fleet might sail at all, ending with another young woman's sacrifice at Achilles' own tomb, demanded so that the same fleet might finally sail home, and it is worth naming plainly what that symmetry actually tells us, that a war fought and remembered across nearly 3,000 years, primarily through the grief and the glory of its male warriors, was bracketed at both its beginning and its very end by the deaths of young women whose own wishes were never once seriously consulted by anyone in the whole of this tradition, and it is worth carrying Iphigenia and Polyxena together with you, alongside Briseis and Chryseis, as we turn now toward a fuller accounting of exactly whose cost this entire glittering, sorrowful war actually was. whose names we kept and whose names we never thought to ask. It is worth pausing here before we move toward the close of tonight's story on a question this whole tradition asks us to sit with honestly, because we have spent this entire night following the rage and the grief and the glory of a single man in extraordinary loving detail, a man whose name has survived, entirely intact, for nearly 3,000 years, spoken and sung and painted and filmed by every century since the Bronze Age palace world that first produced him. And it is worth asking plainly what that same 3,000 years of memory actually cost the people standing at the edges of his own story, whose names we were never given at all. Briseis, whose fate set the entire quarrel of the Iliad into motion, speaks for herself only once in the whole poem, mourning over Patroclus' own body near the story's very end and revealing, in that single brief speech, that Patroclus himself had once promised her, gently and kindly, that Achilles would marry her properly once the war was finally won. A small tenderness this whole story otherwise gives us almost no space to imagine. A captive woman who had, by this point, lost an entire city and an entire family to the very army now fighting over which of its leading men would keep her, and who has never, in the whole of the poem's own nearly 16,000 lines, asked a single time what she herself might have wanted. Chryses, whose return to her own father set off the whole chain of events that started this entire quarrel, disappears from the story almost as soon as she has served her narrative purpose. Her own feelings about being held captive in the first place, or about being returned, never once explored at all. And it is worth remembering, too, all the other women this whole war produced and never named, the countless captured wives and daughters of every smaller city Achilles and the rest of the Greek army sacked across those unrecorded 9 years of raiding. We discussed earlier tonight a whole population of ordinary people whose entire lives were shattered by a war fought, on the Greek side at least, over one queen's abduction and one commander's wounded honour, and whose own names did not survive at all, because nobody in this whole 3,000-year tradition thought to write them down. It is worth pausing too on what the actual mechanics of captivity looked like for these women once a city had fallen, because the poem is not entirely silent about it, however little space it grants to any single captive woman's own interior life. Captured women in this world were divided among the victorious army according to rank and contribution, in exactly the same formal process that distributed captured cattle and captured bronze, a queen or a princess fetching a far richer portion for whichever leader claimed her than an ordinary craftsman's wife or daughter would, and set to work, once claimed, at the ordinary domestic labour of the household that now owned them, grinding grain by hand at a quern from before dawn until well after dark, spinning and weaving wool and linen into cloth, fetching water, nursing the children of the very men who had killed their own husbands and fathers, a fate every noblewoman in the poem, Andromache and Hecuba and Helen alike, names explicitly as the thing they fear most in the world, worse, in Hector's own words to his wife at the wall, than death itself. It is worth carrying that fear with you now, alongside every other grief this whole story has asked you to hold tonight, because it means that when the poem's own men speak so often and so eloquently of glory and undying fame, the women standing beside them in nearly every single scene are speaking instead of a far more immediate and far more practical dread, not what will be sung about them in 3,000 years, but what will actually happen to their own bodies and their own children before the following winter even arrives. It is worth pausing too on the ordinary soldiers of this war, the men who fought and died on both sides across 9 long years of siege, without ever once being granted a speech, a grief, or even so much as a single line establishing who they had been before the war took them. Men the old poem sometimes lists in long formal rolls of the dead, names given, and then never mentioned again, killed in a single line of verse and forgotten by the poem itself in the very next one. And it is worth remembering that for every Achilles or Hector or Patroclus, this whole tradition gave a full and lovingly detailed death. There were, without question, thousands of ordinary men on that same battlefield, whose own deaths mattered every bit as much to the mothers and wives and children waiting for them back home, and whose own names simply did not survive the retelling. This whole channel has always believed that a story worth telling honestly has to make room, wherever it can, for exactly this kind of uncounted loss, and it is worth carrying all of them with you now, nameless as they remain, as we move toward the final stretch of tonight's long story. How much of this actually happened, and how poet 3 centuries later still knew a dead world's own true shape. It is worth pausing, before we let this story close, on the same question we asked at length in our earlier telling of the whole Trojan War in this room, because it matters just as much to Achilles' own individual story as it does to the war that surrounds him. And it is worth answering it honestly rather than simply assuming, the way popular memory so often does, that a story this detailed and this emotionally precise must have been either entirely true or entirely invented, when the actual answer sits, as it so often does with these old stories, somewhere considerably more interesting in between. There is no archaeological evidence, and there almost certainly never will be, for a single warrior named Achilles. No grave, no inscription, no contemporary Bronze Age record of any man matching his particular story. And it is worth being honest about that absence plainly, here at the very end of a whole night spent following his life in such loving and specific detail. What the archaeology at Hisarlik, the real hill or hillside mound above the Dardanelles that we walked through in detail in our earlier telling of this whole war, does tell us is that a real city stood on that site across many centuries of the Bronze Age, that one of its layers, conventionally labelled Troy the Seventh A by the archaeologists who have spent more than a century now excavating it, shows genuine signs of violent destruction and fire, are roughly the right period to have inspired the oldest layers of this whole tradition, and that the world Homer describes, the boar's tusk helmets, the specific bronze weapons, the particular shape of the great body-length shields carried by the poem's oldest heroes, matches, in ways that surprised even the scholars who first noticed it, actual archaeological evidence from the late Bronze Age, rather than from Homer's own considerably later era, suggesting that genuine, specific memories of that older, vanished world survived, passed down by voice alone across 4 centuries of a genuine Dark Age, with no writing at all, folded into a poem that only reached its final written form centuries after the events it describes had already passed entirely out of living memory. It is worth pausing too on how a story this long, some 15,000 lines of tightly structured verse in the Iliad alone, could possibly have been carried across those same 4 centuries by the memory and voice alone, with no writing at all to fix it in place, because the answer, worked out only within the last 100 years, is genuinely one of the more remarkable discoveries in the whole history of literary scholarship. An American classicist named Milman Parry, working in the 1930s, travelled to the mountains of the former Yugoslavia specifically to study a living tradition of oral epic poetry still practiced there by illiterate bards, singers who could perform poems many thousands of lines long from memory, without ever having written a single word of them down, and Parry discovered, listening to those same living singers' work, that they were not actually memorised or memorising their poems word for word at all, but composing them fresh in each individual performance, out of a vast inherited toolkit of ready-made phrases and formulas, stock descriptions and repeated epithets sized to fit the poem's own metrical pattern: swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea. Phrases the singer could reach for instinctively, the way a skilled speaker reaches for common turns of phrase in ordinary conversation, to fill out a line while his own mind moved ahead to what happened next. It is worth pausing on what that discovery meant for a poem like the Iliad, because it explained for the first time in the long history of scholars puzzling over Homer exactly why the poem itself is so full of those same repeated phrases and formulas, not because a single careful writer chose them deliberately for their own poetic effect, but because generations of singers, performing this same story night after night for audiences across 4 centuries of the Greek world with no writing at all, had built up exactly the kind of flexible, formulaic toolkit that let an oral tradition this large and this old survive, intact enough to still move people to tears, all the way to the moment someone at last finally wrote it down. It is worth pausing too on one small and genuinely startling piece of evidence that the decipherment of an ancient Mycenaean script called Linear B, cracked at last by a British architect and amateur linguist in the early 1950s, actually handed back to us, because among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from the ruins of Mycenaean palaces, mostly dry administrative records of grain and wool and bronze, inventories of exactly the kind of unglamorous palace bookkeeping this whole tradition otherwise leaves entirely out of its own poems, there appear, on a small handful of those same tablets, personal names, ordinary Bronze Age men and women identified by name in connection with rations or land holdings, and among those names, recorded in a script that had not been read by any living person for more than 3,000 years until it was finally deciphered, is a name that transliterates, letter for careful letter, into exactly the form that would become, centuries later, Achilles. It is worth being honest about exactly what that discovery does and does not tell us, because it does not, in any way, prove that a hero named Achilles fought a 10-year war at Troy, and this channel does not want to overstate what a single administrative record can actually bear the weight of proving. What it tells us, more modestly and more interestingly, is that Achilles was a real ordinary personal name in actual use among real Bronze Age Greek-speaking people, centuries before Homer's own poem ever took its final written shape, which means that whoever first attached that particular name to a legendary warrior in the oldest layers of this oral tradition was drawing on a name already familiar and already in circulation in the actual world of Mycenaean palaces, rather than inventing something out of thin air, one more small thread connecting the glittering half-invented hero of the poems to the genuine, dusty, administratively documented world that first produced the language he was eventually given to speak in. It is worth remembering too that this same Bronze Age world, the gold-masked kings and armoured citadels this whole story takes for granted as its own setting, did not simply fade away peacefully once its own poets finished singing about it, but collapsed within a century or so of whatever real event may have inspired the burning layer at Hisarlik, in a wider catastrophe modern historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, a wave of destruction that swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean at the very end of the 12th century before Christ, toppling the Hittite Empire that loomed behind so much of this world's own politics, burning palace after palace across the Greek mainland itself, Mycenae and Pylos and Tiryns among them, and ending, within a generation or two, the very palace civilization that had produced the gold and the bronze and the chariots this whole story describes so lovingly. Nobody today knows with any real certainty exactly what caused that wider collapse. Earthquakes and famine and mass migration and internal revolt have all been proposed, sometimes in combination, and it is worth pausing on the fact that the war at Troy, whatever its own true size and true cause, unfolded right at the edge of that much larger unravelling. A single conflict remembered in extraordinary loving detail, while the far larger civilizational collapse that followed close behind it was almost entirely forgotten, preserved by later Greeks only as a vague, uneasy memory of a golden age that had somehow ended, a silence that meant the 4 centuries of darkness this whole tradition had to survive by voice alone were not simply empty years, but the actual aftermath of one of the great catastrophes of the ancient world. It is worth pausing too on what this actually means for a figure like Achilles specifically, because it suggests that a poet working centuries after the fact, drawing on a long oral tradition of half-remembered detail rather than any contemporary written record, somehow preserved, with real and specific accuracy, the shape of a whole vanished military and social world even while inventing, elaborating and mythologizing the individual human stories that populate it. A single man's rage and grief and choice between two fates built. In other words, not out of whole cloth, but out of the same careful, accumulated, centuries-long process of memory, becoming myth that we described in detail in our earlier telling of this whole war. Water becoming ice, one careful retelling at a time. Whether a single warrior exactly like Achilles ever actually lived and fought and grieved in precisely this way, we will almost certainly never know, and it is worth admitting, honestly, that it is almost certainly not true in any literal sense. A single man dipped in a magic river and killed by a single arrow to one unguarded heel. But it is worth admitting too that the emotional truth underneath the myth, the specific and universal experience of a young man weighing a short, brilliant life against a long-forgotten one, of a grief so total it curdles into rage, of an old enemy's tears finally breaking through a fury that nothing else could reach, does not actually require a single historical warrior to have lived it exactly as told in order to remain, nearly 3,000 years later, one of the truest stories human beings have ever told about themselves. It is worth pausing too on the sheer number of hands this story has passed through simply to reach you tonight, because the version we have been telling you across this whole long night is, itself, a translation of a translation of a translation, the ancient Greek reshaped into English by generations of scholars and poets, each making their own choices about which qualities of the original to preserve, Alexander Pope in the early 1700s rendering the whole poem into rhymed, elegant couplets that read more like formal English verse than anything a Bronze Age audience would have recognised. Richmond Latimer in the middle of the 20th century, working to preserve the poem's own driving, rolling rhythm as closely as English could manage it. Robert Fagles rendering it decades later into a version prized for its own muscular, readable energy. And, more recently still, Emily Wilson producing a translation praised for its clarity and for the careful, deliberate attention she paid to exactly the kind of overlooked lives, captive women and nameless soldiers among them, that this whole channel has tried to keep returning to across tonight's own telling. Every one of those translators made real and consequential choices about what this story actually is, and it is worth remembering as this night's own telling draws toward its close, that what you have been listening to is one more link in that same very long chain, one more person doing their own best, imperfect work to carry a 3,000-year-old grief a little further down the road toward whoever is listening next. A story too good to stay buried in one century. It is worth pausing before we trace this story's path through the ancient world it was born into, on how completely it has continued to find new audiences and new forms in our own considerably more recent age, because a story capable of surviving 3,000 years of retelling does not simply stop being retold the moment the ancient world itself comes to an end. Dante Alighieri, writing in the early 1300s, placed Achilles, of all the figures he might have chosen from the whole of pagan antiquity, among the souls punished in the circle of his own inferno, reserved for those overcome by lust, a judgment that startles most modern readers, who tend to remember Achilles for his rage rather than for any romantic weakness, but one that reflects the medieval world's own particular reading of the Penthesilea episode and the later doomed love affair some ancient sources gave him with Priam's daughter Polyxena, proof that even a poet writing some 2,500 years after the war that Troy supposedly ended still felt he owed his own readers a clear moral verdict on a man whose story by that point had already been retold and reinterpreted more times than anyone could count. Our own century has found still newer forms for the same old story. A major film released in the early 2000s brought Achilles to a mass global audience once again, compressing this whole 10-year war into a single dramatic conflict and inventing, for its own dramatic purposes, an ending that differs considerably from anything the old poem itself describes. and it is worth noting without much complaint that this whole channel understands completely why a modern film would want a tidier shape than 3,000 years of layered, contradictory myth actually provides. A novel published in the early 2010s, built entirely around the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, and narrated in Patroclus's own voice, found an enormous and devoted modern readership, treating openly and without ambiguity a question the ancient sources themselves, as we discussed a little while ago tonight, were content to leave genuinely unresolved. And it is worth noting that a very large number of today's listeners likely came to this whole story first through that novel, rather than through Homer's own poem at all. One more link in a chain of retelling that stretches, unbroken in spirit if not in exact detail, all the way back to a Bronze Age Aegean world that vanished more than 3,000 years ago. It is worth sitting for a moment with how strange and how wonderful that continuity actually is. A story about a choice between two fates, first sung around fires by voices with no writing at all to preserve them, still finding its way night after night into the hands and the ears of people who are never going to stop needing to hear it. A hero borrowed by an actual king, and a name that outlived every empire that claimed it. It is worth pausing before we come to tonight's final meditation on how completely this particular story outgrew the poem that first gave it its fullest shape, because very few figures from the whole of the ancient world have proven quite so durable or quite so useful to the powerful people who came after him as Achilles has. Alexander the Great, whose own conquest reshaped the ancient world within a single astonishing decade, is said by several ancient historians to have carried a copy of the Iliad with him on every one of his own campaigns, kept by one persistent tradition in a jewelled casket that had once belonged to the Persian king he had just defeated, and to have visited, at the very outset of his own invasion of Asia, the site of Troy itself, where he ran, according to Plutarch and Arrian both, naked around the tomb the ancient world already believed to be Achilles' own, in company with his own closest friend Hephaestion, who ran, in a detail Alexander's own contemporaries would have understood immediately, around a separate tomb believed to belong to Patroclus, a young king in the very first weeks of a war that would eventually carry him to the edge of India itself, quite deliberately reenacting at the very start of his own campaign the specific bond between one warrior and one beloved companion that this whole story has spent tonight showing you mattered more to Achilles than nearly anything else in his own short life. And it is worth pausing on the fact that Alexander is said to have called Achilles fortunate specifically for having found in Homer a poet capable of making his own brief life immortal, a young conqueror already, at the very outset of his own campaign, thinking carefully about which poets and which historians might one day be trusted to tell his own story the same way. The Romans, inheriting this whole tradition centuries later, gave Achilles a somewhat more complicated legacy, since their own founding myth, the story of Aeneas we have told in full on Another Night in This Room, required a Trojan hero to survive the very war Achilles himself had so thoroughly dominated, and it is worth pausing on one small, quiet detail buried inside the Iliad itself, because it turns out Homer had already prepared the ground for that later Roman story centuries before Virgil ever wrote a word of it, showing us a moment in the fighting when Achilles very nearly kills Aeneas himself in single combat, only for the god Poseidon, who otherwise favoured the Greeks throughout this entire war, to intervene and save the young Trojan prince specifically because, the god explains, Aeneas and his own descendants were fated to survive the fall of Troy and found a new and lasting dynasty elsewhere. A single small moment of divine mercy toward the one Trojan hero this whole tradition had already marked, centuries before Rome itself existed, as destined to outlive the city Achilles was in the very same breath, doing everything in his power to destroy. And it is worth noting, finally, how thoroughly this single-man story is settled into the ordinary language of the modern world. So thoroughly that the phrase "an Achilles' heel" has become, in English and in a great many other languages besides, simply the standard way of naming any single point of weakness hidden inside an otherwise formidable strength, a phrase most people who use it today have likely never traced back to its actual source. a grieving mother, or a Roman poet's invention of one, trying desperately and ultimately unsuccessfully to make her own son safe from a fate she could already see coming. And it is worth carrying that small, quiet irony with you now, that the single detail of this whole story most people actually remember today is not the rage, and not the choice between two fates, and not even the tears shared with an old enemy in a tent outside Troy, but one small, vulnerable, entirely human point of failure, hidden inside a man everyone else in the story believed to be nearly invincible. Let us walk back briefly through the whole shape of the road that carried us here, because a story with this many turns deserves, before we let it close, one last look at the whole distance it has travelled. We began on a mountainside, with an unwilling goddess wrestled into a marriage she never chose, and an uninvited goddess of discord tossing a single golden apple into a wedding feast that would eventually cost an entire city its own walls. We followed an infant said, by poets writing more than 1,000 years after the oldest layers of this story had already taken shape, to have been dipped by one heel into the black waters of the underworld, and we were honest with each other about how much of that particular image belongs to Rome, rather than to the older Greek tradition that actually gave us this hero in the first place. We climbed, with that same boy, into the mountains above Phthia, to a centaur's household where he was fed on the marrow of lions and taught, in the same breath, medicine and music, the healing of wounds and the singing of the very glories he would one day be sung for himself. We heard his own mother lay out, in words no other mother in this whole tradition is ever quite so plainly given, the two fates open in front of her son, a long life spent forgotten or a short one spent remembered forever, and we watched him choose, and then watched that same mother spend the rest of his life trying, in small and ultimately futile ways, to soften a choice she could not undo. We hid with him among the daughters of a distant island king, and watched Odysseus's own clever trumpet and sword expose a disguise that could hide everything about this particular young man, except the one reflex no disguise could ever fully suppress. We stood on a beach at Aulis, and watched his own name used, without his own knowledge or consent, to lure a young woman to an altar, and we carried her, and the rage that discovery provoked in him, forward through 9 unrecorded years of raiding, 23 cities burned or broken, an entire regional world ground down city by city so that one single walled capital might eventually be starved into falling. We watched a plague and a quarrel over a captive woman who had already lost her husband and her brothers to the very man now claiming her, turn a wounded honour into a withdrawal that nearly cost an entire army its own ships, and we watched 3 good men, a clever speaker, a loyal old teacher, and a blunt and honest friend, fail, each in his own way, to talk that wound back into anything workable. We watched a friend borrow another man's armour out of love rather than ambition, and press an advantage too far in the heat of an afternoon's sudden glory, and die for it, and we watched a mother rise from the sea one final time, not to argue her son out of the fury that death provoked in him, but to arm him for it instead, carrying up from the depths a shield with an entire peaceful world etched into its own rim, weddings and harvests and dancing floors carried into the single most violent stretch of his entire life. We watched a river choke on the dead and rise up in its own fury to answer for it, and 2 immortal horses weep in the dust, and one of them, for a single forbidden moment, speak. We watched a wife beg her husband not to go, and a small boy cry at the sight of his own father's helmet, and we watched that same father run 3 times around his own city's walls before a disguised goddess tricked him into finally standing his ground, and we watched, at the very end of all of it, an old king cross an entire hostile army alone in the dark, guided part of the way by a god moved to unexpected tenderness, and kneel and kiss the hands that had killed so many of his own children, and we watched a rage that had consumed nearly everything else in this story finally break, not into more violence, but into 2 enemies weeping together over 2 entirely different, entirely equal griefs. That is the whole shape of the road that carried us here, and it is worth sitting with the whole of it now, together, one final time, before we let it close for the night. what this whole long night was really asking. We're nearly at the end of tonight's telling, and it is worth pausing before we let this story finally close to set Achilles beside the other great figures we have spent long nights with in this room, because the comparison tells us something true about what this particular story was actually built to explore that none of those other tales quite manage in the same way. Heracles, in the long and sorrowful story we told across an entire night in this room, spent his whole life atoning for a catastrophe that was never truly his own fault, a grief inflicted on him from the outside by a jealous goddess, answered not by any single choice but by the patient, exhausting willingness to keep completing one impossible labour after another. Odysseus, in the long wandering we spent so many nights following, survived not through strength or glory at all, but through patience and cunning, holding a distant home firmly in his own mind across every temptation the sea threw in his path. Aeneas carried a duty that was never truly his own to choose, setting aside his own private wants again and again in favour of a nation's future he would never live to see. Achilles belongs beside all three of these men, and yet he is different from every one of them in a way worth naming plainly before we close. He did not have his fate imposed on him the way Heracles did, arriving already assembled and inescapable before he had done anything at all to deserve it. He did not hold a single, steady destination in his mind the way Odysseus held Ithaca, because Achilles' own destination, once he sailed for Troy, was always going to be a grave rather than a home, and he did not accept a duty laid on him by prophecy, and by the gods the way Aeneas accepted his, a burden he might, in some other version of his own character, have simply set down. Achilles chose, with his eyes open, at an age when most of us have not yet begun to understand what a genuine choice even costs, a short and brilliant life over a long and quiet one, and the entire remainder of his own story, the rage and the withdrawal and the grief that curdled into a fury even a river could not withstand, and, at the very end, the tears shed freely with an old man whose sons he had killed, is the record of a person discovering in real time and at unbearable cost exactly what that single early choice actually meant once it had to be lived through, day by day, rather than simply weighed in the abstract by a worried mother on a quiet afternoon before any war had even begun. It is worth pausing too on how strange it is that a story built around a choice this stark should end up, by its own final chapters, questioning the very terms of that choice more openly than any other single story this channel has told in this room. Heracles never doubts that his own labours are worth completing, however exhausting, because the alternative, an unatoned grief, is simply worse. Odysseus never doubts that Ithaca is worth the whole 10 years it costs him to reach it. But Achilles, alone among these men, is given, in the middle of his own poem, a genuine moment of doubt about the entire value system his own life had been organised around, telling Odysseus plainly that a single day of living outweighs every cow and every measure of gold Troy could ever offer, and then, remarkably, choosing Kleos anyway, not because the doubt was resolved, but because a choice made once, at the very outset of a life, has a way of carrying its own momentum forward long after the person who made it has stopped fully believing in its terms, a very old and a very human problem that has nothing to do with bronze spears or ancient prophecies at all, and everything to do with how difficult it actually is for any of us to set down a course we charted for ourselves years before we understood what it would actually demand. It is worth returning one final time to the shield Hephaestus forged for him on that terrible night after Patroclus' death, because it is the single image this whole story leaves us with, that holds both halves of Achilles' own bargain at once, a whole peaceful world of weddings and harvests and dances etched in gold and silver around the rim of the very weapon he carried into the narrowest, most consuming rage of his entire life, and it is worth sitting for a moment in the space between those two things, the world Achilles gave up in exchange for undying fame, and the war that fame actually cost him. A war that took his dearest friend, and then, not very much longer afterward, took him as well. Kleos brought him exactly what his mother had promised it would. A name that has now outlived every single one of the palaces and the kings and the whole glittering Bronze Age civilization that first produced his story, spoken and sung and painted and filmed for nearly 3,000 years by people who never knew a single other detail about the world he supposedly lived in. But it is worth asking, honestly, whether Achilles himself, in the one unguarded moment this whole tradition gives him to actually answer that question, sitting in his own tent telling Odysseus that a single day of a living man's life outweighs all the glory Troy could ever offer, would have called that particular bargain a fair one. And it is worth admitting that the poem never lets him fully decide, leaving him instead exactly where real grief so often leaves a person, holding two irreconcilable convictions in the same aching chest at once. A life is worth more than any fame, and I would not trade the fame I am about to die for. It is worth carrying one last thought with you before we let this long night finally close, because it is the thought this channel keeps returning to whenever it tells a story built around a choice nobody should ever really have to make. We have spent tonight with a man who was raised on the marrow of lions, specifically so that he could become exactly what this story needed him to become, who wept on a beach like a small child the very first time his own honour was wounded, who let an entire army nearly burn on the shore rather than set aside a grievance that felt, in the moment, unbearable, who lost the one person he loved most in the world because of that very grievance, and who answered that loss with a rage so total it drew in rivers and gods, and in the very last chapter of his own life, an old man's kiss upon his own hands. And it is worth remembering, as you let yourself drift now toward your own rest, that the choice this whole story keeps circling, a short, brilliant life against a long, quiet one, is not actually a choice most of us are ever asked to make in anything so stark a form, and that there is a particular kind of grace, worth noticing before you close your own eyes tonight, in simply being permitted the long, ordinary, unremarkable years that Achilles himself was never given. Years with no undying fame attached to them at all, and no epic poem waiting 3,000 years down the line to sing your name, but years all the same, spent among people who love you, which was, in the end, the very thing his own mother tried, and failed, to give him. It is worth remembering too, one final time, everyone else this story asked us to carry alongside him tonight, because a story this old and this well-loved can make it easy to let its central figure crowd out everyone standing at his own edges. Patroclus, who wept like a small girl tugging at her mother's dress and asked for nothing but the chance to help his own exhausted friends. Briseis, who had already lost a husband and 3 brothers to the very man she then had to serve, and who is remembered in her own single surviving speech, not for any bitterness, but for mourning a kindness Patroclus had once shown her. Andromache, who begged a husband she already knew she could not keep to stay behind a wall he could not, in the end, bring himself to hide behind. Priam, who knelt in an enemy's tent because grief had made him braver than any battlefield ever could. And Peleus, an old man in a northern kingdom this whole story never once takes us back to, who is, so far as any surviving version of this tale ever tells us, still waiting, even now, for a son who is never coming home. It is worth letting all of them settle quietly into the dark alongside you tonight, not as background figures in someone else's glory, but as the whole other half of a story that was always underneath its own rage and its own bronze and its own undying fame, about exactly how much an ordinary human life is worth, and how rarely in the end that worth is ever measured out fairly. That brings us to the end of our story. There is no more river left for him to fight, and no more wall left to run around 3 times in the dark. The pyre has burned down at last. 2 friends' ashes mixed together in a single quiet mound above a shore that gave up trying to hold either one of them a long time ago, and a whole glittering, furious, grief-soaked war has finally gone still, folded now into nothing more than a poem, and the poem in its own turn, folded into a story a stranger is telling you, gently, in the dark, 3,000 years later. If you're still awake, you do not have to be. If tonight's long story carried you somewhere good, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, and if you would like to, leave a thought down in the comments, and I will read it in the morning, but that is tomorrow's business, and it can wait. For now, let your body settle a little more heavily into the bed beneath you. Let your own shoulders finally set down whatever weight they have been carrying all day without your even noticing. There is no glory waiting for you tonight that is worth losing a single hour of rest over, no undying name that needs defending before you allow yourself to sleep, only the quiet, unremarkable, entirely sufficient gift of one more ordinary night, which is the very thing an old king once crossed an entire hostile army in the dark simply to beg for, and which is yours already, freely, without any bargain at all. Let your breathing slow, all on its own, the way it wants to, and let the sound of a distant sea fade out gently behind you, the way it once carried a mother's grief up from the depths to find her son, and let it carry you instead somewhere calm and somewhere safe, and somewhere entirely your own. There is nothing left to prove tonight, no honour left to defend, no undying name that needs to be earned before you're allowed to rest. Close your eyes and let yours come now too. Good night and sweet dreams.